Section 1. The Red Canyons had a rule older than any of their wars, and the company learned it in the first hour. In the country above the hollow deep, you never trusted the silence, because the silence down there was never empty. It was listening. They came down off the rimfall at dawn, with the ash river of the enemy smoking on the northern horizon, and the world changed nations under their feet inside a mile. Frost Hollow ended the way a held note ends. The Red Country began the way an argument does. Rust-colored stone rose around the old trade track in walls and towers, and wind-carved colossi, banded in 100 shades of fire, ochre, umber, dried blood crimson, and the cold white light of the fen gave way to a low amber sun that turned every canyon mouth into a furnace door. The wind here did not howl, it muttered, working through 10,000 slots and hollows in the stone, a country-sized throat forever clearing itself, and beneath the mutter, beneath the hoofbeats, beneath everything, there was the other thing, the thing that made Derm's dwarves ride with their eyes on the ground and their knuckles white on their axes. The deep tunnels of the canyon country were silent. Wrong, Derm said flatly, the first time they watered the stags at a dry country well. You'll not feel it, lady, no offense meant. Surface folk never do, but this whole country is hollow as a drum, and a drum makes noise. The Orc deep roads run under every mile of it, air shafts, waterworks, the breathing of a nation. My grandfather traded down these tracks before the sealing, and he said you could put your ear to any stone in the Red Country and hear the canyons living. He straightened from the well, and his drill-bit eyes went to the rust-red silence around them. I've had my ear to 6 stones since the rimfall. There's nothing down there moving. A whole nation under our feet, holding its breath. Or, he didn't finish it, because nobody finished sentences like that in the country above the pool. They rode hard, and they rode watched, and they rode all that first morning in sight of the end of the world, because the trade track ran south of east along the high benches, and from the high benches the northern horizon was one unbroken wrongness, the Ash River. Morvath's marching strength lay across the Red Country's north like a grey serpent laid over a hearth, days wide, its dust pool climbing the sky in a slow brown thunderhead that did not disperse, and through Valis's glass, in the worst glimpses, the column resolved. Rank on rank of man-shaped absence, spear-tips of banked red fire, moving at the unhurried pace of things that had waited 30 years and intended to savor the arithmetic. The company was racing the serpent's flank, faster, for now, on better roads, but everyone who did the map work knew what the serpent knew. All roads in the Red Country, theirs and its, converged on the same deep sink of land, the hollow deep, the pool, the lid the canyons were standing on. Note for the record, Phelan rasped, on the second bench, looking north. That's the first army I've ever seen that doesn't raise dust ahead of itself. It's all behind them, like the ground stops being ground once they've... He stopped. Nobody asked him to finish. Lena felt it by the second hour, the way she felt a wrong pulse. Nothing she could point to, everything she could sense. Valis confirmed it by the third, without turning his head. High walls, both sides, moving when we move. Phelan, whose new deep voice had not yet stopped surprising him, asked the question of the whole column. If they're watching, why aren't they stopping us? Because we are not the interesting thing in their country today, Doromir said quietly, and nodded north, to the smoke of the marching ash. They are watching everything. They are deciding what we are, and in the canyons, he touched the tear beneath his collar, 30 years of closed eastern roads in the gesture. What they decide all at once. They decided at noon, at the place the maps called the Gates of Salt. It was a canyon narrows, where the old trade road passed between 2 natural towers, and the company was halfway through it when the Red Country did the thing it had been patiently arranging all morning. It stood up. The rim of both walls, the shadowed slots, the wind-carved hollows, every piece of stone that had been only stone for hours, grew figures, 50 of them, 100, rust-armored and dust-cloaked, arisen out of their own country like the canyon's opinion-made flesh, and ropes hissed, and the narrows filled before and behind with warriors, and the company of 20 stood ringed in a nation's held breath. Lena's first living orcs were, like her first dwarves, a correction. The stories of her world had promised brutes. The stories of this world, 30 years stale, had promised savagery in the canyons. What ringed them at the Gates of Salt was a warband of terrible discipline, tall, grey-green, tusked and scarred, armored in lacquered hide and salvaged iron, and utterly, professionally silent, moving on hand signs, arrows steady, every warrior's position covering two others. Vilas took one long look at their overlapping fields of fire and made the small sound he reserved for craftsmanship. Their leader came down the rocks with the deliberate lack of hurry that Lena now recognized across every people of two worlds as the true voice of authority. A war captain, a woman, broad as Durm and a head taller than Doromir, her tusks capped in worn bronze, one eye lost long ago to something with claws, the scar wearing her face like a badge of office, and she walked the line of the surrounded company slowly, reading them, the elves, the dwarves, the wagons, the small human woman in the white coat. When she spoke, her trade tongue was rough and fluent, and entirely without heat, which made it worse. 30 years, she said, the mountain folk do not come, the ice folk do not come. Our roads close, our dead stay ours, our fires burn alone, and the world calls it peace. The single eye traveled the column. Now the ash marches on our north, the deep goes quiet under our feet, and in the same season, elves and dwarves come armed down the salt road together, with covered wagons, asking no leave. She stopped in front of Doromir, and looked at the shape of him, and the crest of him, and the collar that could never quite hide the tear's teal pulse. And wearing that. So, before my arrows decide what my king should hear about instead, someone in this column will tell me one true sentence about why you are in my country. 1. Choose it with care. The column held its breath. Doromir opened his mouth. King's word, embassy protocol, a season of lawmaster's training. And Lena, reading the war captain's single eye, the way she read every triage room, saw what was actually being tested, and got there first. We're here because your deep tunnels have gone silent, she said, and we know what's silencing them, and we came to fight it beside you, not for you. Nobody in this column thinks the canyons need rescuing. We think the canyons are about to be the front line of the whole world, and we'd rather bleed on the right side of it. The silence that followed had a different texture. The war captain turned, slowly, and looked at the small human as if seeing her for the first time, which, Lena understood, was exactly what had happened. Humans in the Red Country were a rumor 30 years dead. The single eye narrowed. The little one knows the deep is quiet, the captain said. The little one knows what silences it. And the little one is very careful, a step closer, testing, tusks and bronze and one eye like a drill. Not to say poor orcs, not to say we came to save you. Another step. Why so careful, little one? What do you know of the canyons? I know one thing, Lena said, and held the eye, and gave the answer Erling of the Kant Peaks had spent a dying season teaching her, word, for exactly this ground. I know that in the Red Country there are 100 insults and one unforgivable one. And I didn't ride across 2 nations to pity the only people in this world who never once needed anyone's. For a long moment, the gates of salt held nothing but wind. Then the war captain of the canyons did something with her scarred face that was not a smile. The canyons did not give smiles away to strangers, but was the geological event several miles upstream of one, and turned to her rim lines and made one hand sign. And 100 arrows came off draw as one arrow. I am Gazra, first fang of the eastern passes, she said. You will surrender nothing, and you will be escorted everything. My king will want the little one who knows the old courtesies. The single eye cut to Doromir, and 30 years sharpened it. And he will want the elf who wears the mountain's heart into our country. In the season, the deep goes dark. Oh, he will want that conversation very much. She turned, and the warband flowed into march order around the column, like water taking a shape it had already decided on. Ride, and keep your wagon sealed. The road to Karagvor is long, and my warriors have been very bored for 30 years. The escorted afternoon taught Lena more about the canyons than a season of lawmasters had, because Gazra, having decided the little one was interesting, rode beside her and conducted what both of them understood perfectly well was a mutual interrogation disguised as conversation. She learned that the Red Country was not a wilderness, but a lattice, that every canyon was a street, every mesa a district, and the true nation lay below, in the deep roads. 300 generations of delving, herds stabled underground against the sun, whole harvests of cave fruit and blind fish, and the great cisterns that made the orcs the only people in the world who had never once lost a war to thirst. She learned that the ceiling, 30 years ago, had been the canyon's grief dressed as the canyon's anger. 400 of the ice folk died on our northern marches when the ash reprised Little One. And do you know what the world's histories call that battle? Nothing. They do not call it anything. The dwarves buried theirs, the elves sang theirs, and ours who died covering the ice folks' retreat, 1100 of ours, got one line in a mountain ledger. The eastern tribes also suffered losses. Tribes. The bronze-capped tusks ground once, 30 years of it in the sound. So we closed the roads. If the world would not count our dead, the world did not need our roads. You want to know the canyons, healer? We are not warlike. We are ledger-keeping. The ice folk understand it better than the tall folk ever did. We simply keep the ledger in scars. And she learned, because she asked it plainly, and plainness was the coin here, about the tooth. The fang of the first morning. Gazra said the name the way Erling had said Silvarin, the way Skalvar said the cup. It hangs at my king's throat, as it has hung at every king's throat since the world was soft. The mountain folk have their crystal that weeps, the ice folk their cup that promises. Ours bit down, little one, at the very beginning, and never let go. That is the whole of our theology, and I commend its efficiency. The single eye slid to her, canny as a drill. And now, the healer of two worlds rides into our country in the dark season, carrying, my scouts have noses, do not insult them, something warm and golden in her pack that hums like a struck bell when the wind is right. So we both know what conversation is truly riding to Karagvor. A beat. Convince my king the world has learned to count, healer, or the fang stays bitten down. The wounded came up out of the ground at dusk and changed everything. The escort had made camp in a bay of the canyon where an orc watchpost guarded one of the great deep shaft heads, a stone mouth in the earth, ringed in salt line and totems, the first breathing hole of the silent underworld the company had seen. And it was Phelan, on water detail, who heard it first, the shaft bell below ringing wild, and then the sounds of a nation's held breath breaking, orcs boiling from the watchpost, the great windlass turning, and up out of the silent deep, on the oar cage, came a scout patrol that had gone down 9 strong 2 days ago, 4 of them now, carrying a 5th, and the 5th was the reason the watchpost's discipline was cracking down its seams. He was young, for an orc, Phelan's age in his own people's counting, and he had been written on. The wounds crawled up his left side from hip to jaw in fine, spiraling, deliberate lines, and the flesh around them had gone grey translucent, and he was not bleeding, and he was not screaming. He lay on the stretcher rigid and silent, with his eyes fixed on something that had followed him up out of the dark behind his own face. The watchpost healer, an old orc with a splint-maker's hands, took one look and went still, and began, in a low voice, a chant that Lena's season of lawmasters translated in her bones before her mind caught up. It was not a healing chant, it was a sending chant. The canyons were starting his funeral while he breathed. No, Lena said, and was moving. Gazra's arm came across her path like a bridge gate. Little one, the deep mark is death. It is always death. 3 we have lost this way since the silence began, and the mark does not stop, and the kind thing. The kind thing is the quitting thing, and I don't do it. Lena did not raise her voice. She pitched it under the chant, at the one eye, in the register that made proud people obey. First fang. In my country, I have a rank too, and it comes with one law. No one starts the funeral while I'm still working. I have seen this writing before, on a king, and I bought him a season. Let me through, or watch me go through, but the boy stops being sent in the next 10 breaths either way. The single eye held hers, the chant wavered, and Gazra of the eastern passes, who had been very bored for 30 years, and was not bored now, stepped aside. What Lena did at that stretcher through the next 2 hours, by torchlight, ringed by a watchpost's worth of tusked silence, would run ahead of the column all the way to Karagvor faster than any rider. Ithreni's glowing vial, rationed in drops along the spiral lines, the coal glass bead held against the grey flesh, where its stubborn orange spark made the frost writing recoil, and above all the treatment the undervault had taught her, adapted on her knees in the red dust, the Count. She took the young scout's hand and put it over his own heart and held it there with hers and kept the count against his knuckles, 3 and 1, 3 and 1, and made the 4 survivors of his patrol kneel in and keep it with her and say his name over and over until somewhere past the first hour the eyes fixed on the followed thing let go of it and found the torchlight, and the boy said his own name back, Rook, and began, rigid and silent no longer, to weep like the living. The mark had stopped at his jaw. It had not retreated. She knew this disease now. It never retreated. It waited. But it had stopped, and stopped was alive, and alive was hers. What broke the watchpost open, in the end, was not the medicine. It was the fourth survivor of the patrol, a scarred veteran twice Rook's age, kneeling in the count circle with his hand stacked on the boys and the healers, keeping the rhythm long past the hour it was needed, who looked up at last across the stretcher and asked, in canyon rough trade tongue, the question of a soldier who has watched 3 comrades die of the mark since the silence began. The counting, the name-saying, this is human warcraft against the deep mark. And when Lena answered him honestly, it's older than warcraft. It's what the living do at the edge of the dark on every world I know of. You had it already. You just called it a funeral and started it too soon. The veteran was silent a long moment, and then he took his salt pouch off his belt entire and set it beside the healer's knee and said to his watchpost, to his people, in the deep canyon tongue that Lena's bones translated a half-second late, "Wake the drummers. From tonight, the deep shafts keep the count." The old splint-handed healer knelt across the stretcher from her and looked a long time at the stilled spiral lines, and then did a thing that made every orc in the watchpost go quiet. He took a pinch of salt from the pouch at his belt and placed it deliberately in Lena's palm and closed her fingers over it with both scarred hands. "Sareth," he said. She looked at Gazra. The first Fang's face was doing the geological thing again, further upstream. "There is no word for it in trade tongue," Gazra said. "It is what we give the one who works beside us in the breach. It is not thanks. You will learn, little one, the canyons do not thank. Thanks is a coin, and coins are for strangers." The single eye glinted in the torchlight. "Sareth is closer to shift partner. It means your watch and mine are now the same watch." A pause, and then dry as the red country. "It has not been given to an outsider since before the sealing. My king is going to have questions." "Good," Lena said, folding the salt into the pouch beside 2 beads and a drum. "So am I, starting with what your scouts met down there, Rook, when he can speak. Because that writing isn't a wound, First Fang. It's a message, and I've read its sender's mail before. But it was not Rook, in the end, who delivered the message that ended the day. It was the rider from Karagvor, an orc on a lathered dust runner, arriving at the watchpost an hour past moonrise, with word from the king that pulled Gazra out of the healer's circle, and the 2 of them spoke apart in the deep canyon tongue, fast and low. And Lena watched the first Fang's shoulders change, and then change again, and then Gazra came back to the torchlight and stood over the company of 2 worlds, with one eye full of the strangest expression yet, suspicion and wonder grinding together like fen ice, and said, "New orders. We ride for Karagvor at first light, no halts. My king requires the little one and the elf who wears the heart immediately, because it seems, healer, that you are not the first impossible thing to walk out of the west this week." The eye swept them all and landed on Doramir and delivered it flat. 2 days ago, my king's outriders took a prisoner on the north rim, walking toward the Ash River, alone, on foot. A human man, grey-clad, grey-bearded, old scars, older eyes. He surrendered without a fight, asked for no mercy, and gave the outriders only one sentence for their king. Gazra's tusks caught the torchlight. He said, "Chain me well, keep me far from your deep shafts. And when the healer and the king of the elves arrive, tell them Rowan Voss is ready to finish his letter." The torchlight held the company like a hand. Lena heard Doromir's breath change beside her. 30 years, 12 hunts, 1 bequest, and a bleacher bellow across the foundation of 2 worlds, all of it arriving at last at a single sentence. And it was Valis, of course Valis, who broke the silence with the flat soldier's summary of the entire age. He asked to be chained and kept from the shafts. The captain's eyes were already east, already working. "He is not afraid of your king, First Fang. He is afraid of what listens through him. Ride at first light. Ride now, healer. Letters like that one do not keep."
Section 2. Karagvor did not rise from its country the way Canthalar rose from the mountain or the undervault burned beneath the ice. Karagvor was its country, and the company understood, coming down the last high bench at dusk of the 2nd day, why no army in the history of the Red Land had ever taken it. The capital of the canyons lay at the meeting of 5 great gorges, a junction vast enough to hold weather of its own, and the city was the junction. Tier upon tier of halls and holds carved back into all 10 canyon faces, connected across the gulfs by a spiderwork of chain and plank bridges at 20 different heights, so that the whole city hung in its own airspace like a thought suspended between 5 mines. Cook fires glowed in 10,000 carved windows. Herd smell and forge smell and bread smell rode the canyon wind. Great cisterns caught the last light on terraces of stepped stone, and down the 5 gorge roads in orderly rivers, the outlying clans were coming in. Wagons, herds, banners, the whole Red Nation contracting toward its heart the way a hand contracts toward a fist. And everywhere, under everything, there were the drums. The Count had outrun them. 3 days from a torchlit watchpost, and the deep shafts of an entire nation had taken up the rhythm. Lena heard it rolling from the shaft-head towers on every tier, steady, relayed, unbroken, 3 and 1, 3 and 1. The funeral craft the canyons had started too soon for a generation, turned overnight into the heartbeat of a country refusing to go quiet. Gazra saw the healer hearing it, and the geological almost smile moved somewhere far upstream. "The shaft drummers are calling it the healer's law," she said. "You should know that before my king does. He hates being the last to name things." The bridge gate of the city gave them one more arrival before the circle did. Word of the column had run ahead, but so had the stretcher, Rook of the Eastern Watch, carried home by his patrol to the healers of the 3rd tier, the first soul in a season to come up from the silent deep alive. And as the company crossed the last chain bridge, the boy was waiting at the gate tower, on his feet, gray-marked and unbowed, with his mother beside him and his whole clan behind her. He did not speak. The canyons did not spend words at gates. He crossed to the healer of 2 worlds, and took the salt pouch from his belt, and pressed it whole into her hands. The second entire pouch in 3 days, and Gazra's eye widened at it. And then he turned to face his own city, and struck his fist over his heart, twice, and the gate tower took it up, and the 3rd tier took it up, and the company of 2 worlds rode into Karagvor under the sound of a nation learning the salute of the lower terraces of Kanthalar, taught to it by a boy the dark had given back. "Note for the record," Phelan rasped, suspiciously bright-eyed. "We appear to be exporting the drum. If you have ever entered a city already speaking a language you taught it, you know that Lena Marlowe rode the last bridge into Karagvor with her spine very straight and her eyes very bright, and that no one in the company was unkind enough to comment on either. Tariksai received them the same night, because the canyons did not believe in letting decisions age. The Hall of the Fang was carved into the junction's central spur, a great horn of banded stone standing free at the meeting of the 5 gorges, its summit crowned not with a throne room but with a circle, an open ring of stone beneath the sky, ringed by the banners of the clans, floored with 10,000 years of oath marks cut into the rock, where the kings of the Red Country had taken counsel in the open air since the world was soft, because, Gazra explained, with the particular pride of a people whose architecture was an argument. A king who will not be rained on should not be obeyed. The king of the canyon stood at the circle's center, and he was a correction to every story 2 worlds had ever told. Tariksai was old the way the canyon walls were old, banded and weathered and load-bearing. A mountain of a warrior gone gray at the tusks. One shoulder dropped from some ancient wound and the whole frame rebuilt around the drop, so that he stood like a fortress that had settled and become stronger for it. He wore no crown. He wore the fang, a single tooth the length of a forearm, ancient beyond reckoning, white gold and faintly warm to the eye, hanging at his throat on a chain of braided iron. And Lena felt the cup at her back answer it the moment she entered the circle, warmth to warmth, graft to graft, 2 droplets of the foundation of the world recognizing kin across a stone ring. Tariksai felt it too. She watched him feel it, watched the old king's hand come up, unbidden, to the fang at his chest, and watched his eyes find her pack, and then her, and narrow with the specific canniness of a ruler who has just had a theology confirmed, and resents how much it moves him. So. His voice was the 5 gorges given a throat, vast, unhurried, banded like the stone. The rumors ride faster than the escort. Elves and ice folk armed on my salt road. A human who knows the old courtesies and stops funerals with her hands, shaft drums beating a 4 count from here to the northern rim. The deep-set eyes went down the line of them, Doramir, the Tyr, the wagons, Durm's dwarves, and came back to Lena, and the old king did the thing that told her everything about why this nation had survived on the lid of the world's wound. He skipped the ceremony entirely. "I have 3 problems, healer, and you will hear them in order of size. My deep roads are silent, and the silence eats my scouts, and it wears writing I do not know. The ash marches on my north, all of it, the whole strength of the old enemy, 30 years of patience on the move at last, and my rim watchers say its line of march bends not toward my city but toward the deep sink at the heart of my country, which no army has ever wanted, because there is nothing there to want. And in my lowest cell, chained at his own request, sits a human out of the oldest bad story the canyons know, asking for you." The great head tilted. "The mountain folk sent me heralds for 300 years and I learned nothing from any of them. So we will not do heralds. Stand in my circle, healer of 2 worlds, and tell the canyons plainly, what is under my country, and why does everything in the world suddenly converge on it?" So Lena stood in the oath-marked circle, under the open sky, ringed by the banners of the clans and the rolling count of the shaft drums, and gave the king of the canyons what she had given the undervault. Everything. The wound and the water, the keeping and the fever, the pool below his country, 900 years of the deep gone wrong and the ash river marching to drink it, the 5 grafts, and the warm gold weight at her back, and the fang at his own throat, 3rd of 5. The question that had frightened the deathless. She talked until the moons crossed the circle's rim, and Tariksai listened the way the canyon listens, without one interruption, storing everything, and when she finished, the old king was silent for the space of 20 drum counts. 30 years, he said at last, I have worn the fang and felt it waiting, and told no one, because a king who says his tooth is waiting is a king with a short reign. The dropped shoulder shifted, the fortress resettled. You will want it. That is what the convergence means. The cup came to you under the ice, and now you stand in my circle with your careful courtesies, and somewhere in the plainness is the asking. But before the old king could close the ledger, the king of the Kant Peaks stepped into the circle, and what he did there ran through the banners of the clans like wind through bannercloth because he did not open with the asking. He opened with the debt. 1100, Doramir said. First Fang Gazra gave me the number on the salt road, and I have carried it 2 days like a stone in the boot, king of the canyons, because she is right, and the histories are wrong, and I am the son of the man who signed the ledger that wronged them. 1100 of the Red Country died covering the ice folks' retreat in the reprisals, and the mountain's record gave them 6 words. He reached to his throat and drew out the seed stone on its cord, the sliver of the remembrancer's crystal, warm and clouded, and held it up in the torchlight before the assembled clans. This is a seed of the memory of Canthalar. It drinks presents, not stories, not versions, the true weight of what was. When this war is done, I will send the remembrancer of my people to your circle, and she will sit with your elders and your shaft drummers and your widows for as long as it takes, and every one of the 1100 will be drunk into the stone of the mountain, name by name, deed by deed, not as the eastern tribes also suffered losses. His voice did not rise, it carried, the way his fathers had carried across a hall of 9. As soldiers of the age, in the mountain's own memory, forever, beside our own. That is not the asking, Tariksai. That is not payment for the fang, and I will be insulted on your behalf if anyone calls it that. That is a correction of the record, 30 years late, owed whether you ever give us anything at all. The canyons keep their ledger in scars. He let the seed stone fall back against his chest. The mountain is learning to keep its own honestly. Enter it as you see fit. The circle was silent for a long time under the drums. The clan banners moved in the canyon wind. And Tariksai of the Red Country looked at the young king of the old enemy for the space of 10 counts, and then said, in the voice of the 5 gorges, the sentence that Gazra would later call the most expensive thing her king had said in 40 years. Your father sent me heralds for 300 years. He should have sent you. Then the fortress of him resettled, and the ledger reopened, and the old king finished what he had begun. So hear the canyon's answer before you ask, healer, and hear the ledger under it. The Fang has kept this nation since the first morning. It does not leave the Red Country on a stranger's story. Not for the mountain's grief, not for the ice's dreams, not for the world's wound. It leaves, if it leaves at all, the way everything leaves the canyons. A pause, banded and heavy. Paid for. In the coin we keep. You have stopped one funeral and taught my shaft's account, and that has bought you this circle and my listening, and it has not bought the Fang, and we both respect each other enough to know it. He turned, and the audience turned with him, toward the descending stair. Now, before the asking and the paying, you have an older appointment in my keeping, and I confess, healer, I intend to watch it. The canyons have been owed the end of that story for 30 years. Bring the lamps, elf. The old king's eyes, passing over Doramir, held something that was almost, kindness. He asks after them, the gray one, every day since we took him. He asks whether the lamps are still burning. They kept Rowan Voss in the lowest cell of the central spur, far from the shafts as instructed, and the cell was not a dungeon. The canyons did not waste cruelty on a man who had requested his own chains, but a deep round room of banded stone, lamplit, with a pallet and a table and a guard of 4 at the door, and the company came down to it in the smallest possible number, because some appointments cannot bear weight. Lena, and Doramir, and Tariksai with Gazra at his shoulder, silent by the door, a king collecting a debt of witness. The man at the table stood up when they entered, and the chains rang softly, and 30 years of 2 world stories came to a point in a single human being. He was old now. That was the first fact. And it landed on Doramir. Lena watched it land, like weather. The broad-shouldered soldier of the memory stone was 70, gray-bearded and rope-lean, the carpenter's build of him worn down to wire and weather, his uniform 30 years of patching layered on the ghost of gray. But the eyes were the memory's eyes, exhausted, clever, kind. And they went past the kings and the healer, past the chains and the years and every armor a man can grow, straight to the 2 small flames burning on the belt of the king of the Kant Peaks. They're lit, Rowan Voss said. His voice was gravel and disuse and 30 winters of talking to walls. Bram and Otta. You found the mother then. Or she found you. She always did the finding, that one. Her boys got their stubbornness honestly. He closed his eyes. One breath. A man crossing something off a 30-year list. Good. That's good. I passed her son's names to every wall between the fen and the rim, you know. Somebody had to keep saying them. Rowan. Doromir's voice had gone somewhere Lena had heard it go only twice. At a fire in Silverin, and on a shore at the bottom of the world. He crossed the cell slowly. He was carrying, she saw now, the thing he had carried from a way station across a nation without ever once mentioning it, a child's toy bow, palm-sized, its string long-rotted, its grip worn to a polish that only years of one small hand could give. He set it on the table between them, on the scarred wood, in the lamplight. You kept it, Doromir said. Through the bridge, through the ash, through 30 years of whatever you became. My 9th winter, Rowan. You carried my 9th winter across the end of the world. The old man looked at the little bow for a long time. His chained hands came up and stopped and did not touch it, the hands of a man who has decided he has lost the right. And when he spoke, the gravel had gone to pieces and the pieces were still trying to hold formation. I started a letter, Rowan Voss said. 400 times. The last draft is under a stone at the rimfall. You'll have found it. I never could finish the sentence. 30 years, little prince, and I never once found the end of that sentence. I know, said the king of the Kant Peaks. I've come to finish it for you. And Doromir of the Kant Peaks, Evening Star, 12th Hunter, bearer of the tear, stood before the man who had taught him the bow and broken his world, and delivered his sister's bequest exactly as charged, word for word, in the voice of a man laying down a weight at the end of the age. Lyriel is kept, whole, and still, and content, in the water at the bottom of everything. I have stood on the shore, Rowan, and I have spoken with her, and she charged me with this before every other errand of the war. She said, he has been knocking for 30 years on a door that loves him and must play dead. She said the water cannot answer you, cannot, not will not, because the enemy's hook is in you and he hears every hinge. And she said, his voice held, he had carried this across a nation to say it standing. She held your hand to the last inch, your fingers touched. You were both reaching, and the rope was already cut, and the only failure on that bridge belonged to a knife 3 days behind you in the rocks. She fell with her hand still warm, Rowan. Those are her words. She sends them with these. And he leaned close, and gave the old man the private words, the Fletcher's loft words, the ones the story does not keep. And Lena watched 30 years of a man's architecture come down. Rowan Voss sat down slowly on the pallet, chains ringing, and put his face in his weathered hands, and wept the way the recovered wept at the channel, upward somehow, grief and release indistinguishable. And the king of the canyon stood by the door with his first fang and watched the oldest bad story in the Red Country end, and said nothing, and let it. It was a long time before the old soldier surfaced. When he did, scrubbing his face with his sleeve, soldier's economy, reassembling, he looked first at Lena. A long look, scout thorough, the white coat, the stethoscope, the beads, the salt pouches, the steady green eyes reading him right back. So you're the second, Rowan Voss said quietly. The one the witch went back for. I heard the deep bells ring the granting from 40 miles of rock away. Healer. The whole Red Country heard them, whether it knows what it heard or not. And I have exactly one question before the briefing. And I've carried it longer than you'd believe, so grant an old traitor the answer. The lit eyes held hers. The other side. Home. The cold coffee and the Tuesdays. Does it hold? When you crossed, did it cost what it cost me? Because if she reached into that world a second time and broke a second life to save this one, then some of what I did in the ash was for nothing. The clock stopped at 2:59, Lena said. The minute I left, it's still holding. My world is waiting for me, Rowan. Whole, she learned, or the water taught her. Either way, it held. The old man breathed out 30 years. Then it was worth learning, he said, and the briefing cadence arrived, and the first words out of the finished man were pure Rowan Voss, the cleverest of them, 3 decades of scouting compressed. Then she's safe, and the water's real, and everything I worked out in the ash is confirmed, and we have less time than any of you think. Sit down, all of you. You too, King of the Canyons. It's your floor he's coming for. I've spent 30 years with his hook in me, and here's what nobody's understood. A hook is a line, and a line has 2 ends, and I have spent 3 decades learning to listen back down it. The old scout's eyes swept them, sharp as the memories. I know what he's going to do at the pool. It's not an army he's coming to raise. It's worse. It's so much worse. And the marching column is half theater. The real move is already... Rowan Voss stopped. Mid-word, mid-breath. his whole rope-lean frame going rigid on the pallet, his chained hands closing white on his knees, and the two small lamps on Doromir's belt guttering as one though no wind moved in the deep round cell, and Lena was moving before thought, healer's reflex, and froze one pace out. Because the old man's exhausted kind eyes had come up to meet her, and they were not exhausted, and they were not kind, and they were not his. Something had arrived behind them, patient and gracious, wearing the borrowed face the way a lord had once worn a court, and the voice that came out of Rowan Voss's ruined throat was smooth and unhurried, and fell on the lamplit cell like ash falling on snow. Hello, healer. I see you found my first draft. Section 3. 4 guards went for their blades. Tarek's eye stopped them with one raised hand, because the king of the canyons had understood faster than anyone in the cell what he was being offered. 30 years of enemy, arrived in his own keeping, wearing chains. The canyons did not waste such appointments. Lena did not go for anything. She finished the step she had frozen in, and took the stool across the table from the thing wearing Rowan Voss, and sat down at conversational distance the way she sat down with every dangerous diagnosis, and said, in the voice that made proud men obey, "You're interrupting my patient's history. Make it quick." The borrowed face smiled with muscles that did not belong to it, a gracious, unhurried smile that had presided over a king's table for 30 years. And the ash-on-snow voice turned in Rowan's ruined throat like a key trying a familiar lock. Efficient as ever. Do you know, healer, you are the only being on 2 worlds who has never once in all our acquaintance been afraid of me at the correct moments? It was charming at first. It has begun to cost me sleep, a considerable feat, as I do not sleep. The lit and wrong eyes traveled the cell. The king's, the first fang, the guttering lamps, the little toy bow on the scarred table. Something moved in them at the bow. Quick, filed, gone. And what a gathering you've assembled for me. The sun, the Tooth King, my old draft horse, freshly unburdened. I felt that, you know. The bequest. 30 years I have listened down this line to a man knocking on a door, and an hour ago the knocking stopped, and I confess I came to see what could possibly— You came because you're blind, Lena said. The smile held. The cell did not breathe. You lost your window in the mountain when we closed my face. You lost your shard under the ice when an arrow found it. And worse, something followed the thread home, didn't it? Something looked back up your own line and said, there you are, and for the first time in 300 years you learned what it feels like to be the one watched. She leaned forward, elbows on the scarred table, healer's distance from the patient who wasn't there. So now you're down to one working channel into everything you've built, and it's a 70-year-old scout you broke 30 years ago. And the moment his knocking stopped, you panicked, and you spent the channel. Because this conversation isn't free, is it? Every second you sit in his throat, we're mapping the hook. My colleague behind you has been counting your host's pulse since you arrived. Ithreni at the door did not look up from her work. So no, I don't think you came to see anything. I think you came because for the first time since A Bridge in the Snow, events are happening that Morvath of the Terima did not schedule. How does it feel? For 3 full heartbeats, the borrowed face did nothing at all, and when the voice came again, the grace had a hairline crack in it, and through the crack, briefly, the cell heard the thing the graciousness had been built over 3 centuries to contain, something very old, very cold, and very tired of being patient. It feels, said Morvath, like the last winter before a long spring. Uncomfortable, brief, and entirely survivable, for me. The crack sealed, the grace resumed. But since we are being clinical with one another, my favorite of your registers, healer, truly, let me return the honesty as a courtesy between the only 2 professionals at this table. You have been given a version of history by a talking sea. The keeping, the worth, the grieving water, my people as its fallen surgeons. Malpractice, was it? It does enjoy that framing. The eyes came around to her, and the ash voice dropped, intimate as a Gurney-side whisper. Ask it a question for me, next time you stand on its pretty shore. Ask it what the Terima asked at the end, before we fell. We were its keepers, healer. 10,000 years, we read the marks and tended the endings of every race, and we asked it for one thing in all that time. We asked to keep our own dead, in our own vessels, near our own fires, as every other people keeps a grave, a song, a name day. And your gentle foundation, your grieving sea, your keeper of worth? The borrowed hands closed slowly on the table's edge, and 30 years of chains rang. It said no. It keeps everything, healer. It shares nothing. Every mother of my people who ever begged 1 hour with a kept child was told what your father told you on that shore, in that same warm voice. Being kept is fine. It's better than fine. Cross it off the chart. We did not fall from grace. We were locked out of it, and we learned to pick the lock, and the lock-picking is the whole of what your histories call our evil. So before you carry 3 more grafts to that river, Ask yourself the question underneath the question, the one I have arranged 30 years of the world to make you answer. Who appointed the water the sole keeper of everyone's dead? And what does a healer owe a patient who hoards? The cell was very quiet. The lamps burned. And Lena Marlowe, who had sat with liars and manipulators and the dying and the deathless, felt the poisoned truth of it slide in exactly where it was engineered to, between the 9 minutes she'd been given and the 11 years she hadn't, and set it, deliberately, visibly, on the mental tray where she set every finding pending verification, and answered the oldest monster of the age with the whole of her profession. Then I'll ask it, in front of witnesses, because unlike you, I run my differentials out loud. She stood. Anything else? My patient needs his throat back. One thing more. And here it came. She had felt it assembling under the whole conversation, the way she felt a family assembling toward the question of cost. An offer. The only one I will make, and I make it here, before kings, so that its refusal is also witnessed. You have seen my army. You have deduced, or your draft horse was about to tell you, what awaits below this country, and you cannot stop it. You can only choose what it costs. So, come to the pool, healer, willingly. Alone, or with your king, I am indifferent. Bring your grafts, bring your questions, bring your marvelous unfrightened eyes, and I will call the ash to a halt at the canyon rim, and this stone city and its drumming shafts and its tooth-proud king will be, in the language of your trade, triaged out. Spared, not from mercy, you know me better, but because they were only ever the anvil, healer, never the work. You are the work. You have always been the work. Come willingly, and the anvil goes unbroken. The borrowed face tilted, gracious to the last. They are precious when they come willingly, and you have already crossed one universe on those terms. What is 40 miles more? First Fang, Lena said without turning. Professional question. In the ledger of the canyons, what's the standing rate for a stranger who walks into your king's circle and offers to spare you? Gazra's tusks caught the lamplight. There is no rate, healer. The canyons have never once been offered pity twice. Enter it in the record, then. Lena looked back at the thing in her patient's eyes and gave the deathless her answer in the coin of the red country. The canyons decline to be spared, and so do I. Now get out of my patient's throat, because the man you're wearing has been waiting 30 years to say something, and I'd rather hear him. And Rowan Voss came back up his own line like a diver breaking surface. They all saw it, the war behind the borrowed face, 30 years of hook against 1 hour of bequest, and the whole cell heard the moment the tide turned, because it turned on a sound. Doramir, moving before strategy could vote, had taken the old scout's chained hand in both of his, and was keeping the count against the weathered knuckles the way his healer had taught 2 nations. 3 and 1. 3 and 1. And Rowan Voss, who had spent 30 years knocking on a door that had to play dead, and 1 hour knowing the door loved him back. Rowan Voss gripped the count like a rope over a gorge, and climbed, and the ash voice frayed mid-word, and the exhausted kind eyes surfaced through the wrong ones, and the ruined throat said, in its own gravel, with its own fury, the sentence the cell would quote for the rest of the war. You are in my throat, old man. And she held my hand to the last inch, and you cannot use that against me anymore. Out! The lamp steadied. The rigid frame sagged. And the hook's line went dead. Lena felt it go, the way she felt a fever break, leaving only a 70-year-old man shaking on a pallet in his own chains, grinning like a boy through the shaking, tears in the gray beard. 30 years, Rowan Voss rasped. I have wanted to hang up on that man. The laughter that broke across the cell was ragged and brief and medicinal, and when it passed, the poisoned truth was still sitting on the table where the enemy had left it, and Lena did what she had promised the deathless she would do. She ran the differential out loud. Everyone heard it, so nobody carries it alone in the dark. That's how his gifts work. They compound in private. She counted it off on her fingers, flat, clinical, before the whole cell. Claim? The Terima were the water's keepers, asked to keep their own dead, were refused, and fell picking the lock. Possibility 1. It's a lie, engineered to make me distrust my patient 2 grafts from the river. Possibility 2. It's true, and the water has a history it hasn't volunteered, which would not be the first patient in my career to leave something off the intake form. Possibility 3, and mark it, because it's the one that smells right. She looked around the lamplit cell, at kings and scouts and the first Fang. It's both. A true grievance, 300 years in the curdling, told by the one survivor with every reason to leave out his own half of the story. Grief that got refused and turned to theft. I've seen that disease in 2 worlds. It doesn't make him right, it makes him comprehensible. And comprehensible, first Fang, is how you beat something you can't kill. She picked up the thread of it and put it in her pocket, deliberately, like an instrument. Next shore I stand on, the water answers for this. In front of witnesses. That's the standard of care, and it applies to foundations of universes same as everyone. Note for the ledger. Tarek's eye rumbled from the door, with something banded and grudging and almost warm in it. The healer audits gods. The healer, said Doromir quietly, audits everything. It is the single most reassuring thing on two worlds. Note for the actual record, Phelan rasped from the corner, where he had been standing guard on the door with his new deep voice and his old bright eyes. She also just told the most dangerous being in existence to get out of a man's throat because she'd rather hear someone else. I have served under 3 commanders. None of them ever declined an immortal for scheduling reasons. He shook his head slowly. I'm writing all of this down someday. Nobody at home will believe a word. The examination came first. Triage never slept, and its findings redrew the map of the possible. Lena worked by lamplight with Ithreni, the stethoscope and the coal glass bead and 30 years of frost script under her fingers, and the reading of Rowan Voss was the strangest chart of a career built on strange charts. Through the silver serpent, his heart was 2 sounds, the honest human 2-step, 70 years old and stubborn as Bridgestone, and threaded beneath it, faint, foreign, patient, a second rhythm that was not a rhythm at all but a tension, like a wire humming in a wall, running from the heart's own muscle up through the great vessels toward the base of the skull. The coal glass bead, laid along the wire's path, made the skin beneath it shiver, not the man, the script, and where her fingers pressed, she could feel it the way she'd felt the fen's warm seams through 40 feet of ice, something under the surface, obeying a different room. 30 years, she thought. Erling's needle had crawled a season and nearly killed a king. This had grown with the man, through grief and ash and 400 unfinished letters, until unpicking it from Rowan Voss would be like unpicking a river from its valley. The hook was not in Rowan's mind, as the loremasters had guessed, nor his blood. It was grown through him, a filament of the enemy's forged keeping script, anchored, as she had dreaded, at the heart, fused into the muscle itself by 3 decades of ownership, the oldest and deepest working of its kind she had seen. Erling's needle had been a season old. This was a cathedral of the same architecture. It can't be cut, she said at last, flatly to the waiting cell. To Rowan most of all, because he had asked with his eyes and deserved the chart. Not by my hands, not by the loremasters, not without stopping the heart it's grown into. I'm sorry. I don't soften numbers. I know you don't. The old scout took it like a man receiving expected weather. So we use it. That's the arithmetic, and I did it years ago. A hook is a line is a channel, and a channel serves whoever disciplines it best. He just spent it recklessly in front of your whole council because I frightened him by going quiet, which means from tonight, we own the schedule. We feed the line what we choose, and healer. The lit eyes came up, briefing sharp. Lyriel said the water could unhook me if the enemy weren't listening. Well, there is exactly 1 hour coming when he will be too occupied to listen to anything, and we both know which hour it is, so put me in the ledger for the pool, and let's finish the briefing, he interrupted, because your days just became hours. He laid it out on the cell's scarred table in the trained flat cadence of the finest scout 2 worlds ever shared, and the map of the war turned inside out. The army is theater. Half of it anyway. Oh, it's real. It can break this city, but breaking cities was never the design. 30 years I've listened down that line, and here is what the Ash has actually been doing while everyone watched it march. The deep roads under this country didn't go silent because the pool rose. They went silent because his engineers are in them. The crossing-born, the patient ones, weeks ahead of the column, working down where no scout returns. And they are not digging toward the surface, king of the canyons. The old scout's finger came down on the sketch he'd drawn, on the deep sink, on the pool, and then below it. They're digging under the pool, at the quarantine floor, the natural seal, the last clean stone between 900 years of fever and the world sea beneath everything. Your healer cut the fever's arm in the north and sealed it clean. He learned from that, the way he learns from everything. He's not coming to drink the pool anymore. Rowan Voss looked up and delivered the true shape of the age in 6 words. He's coming to spill it. The silence in the cell had a floor missing. Every river, Lena heard herself say. Her own voice, from the far diagnostic place. Both worlds. The keeping itself, my father, Lyriel, everything the water holds. 900 years of fever dumped into the foundation of 2 universes. And then he doesn't need a wound anymore, Rowan finished quietly. He doesn't need a portal, or a key, or a healer. The between becomes his country, and everything kept becomes his crystal stock, and both worlds die of their own poisoned groundwater over a patient century while he harvests. The march is the anvil healer. The hammer is already underground, and by the count I've kept. The old scout looked at the cell's stone ceiling, through it, down through a nation of silent roads to the drilling dark. The hammer is days from the floor. It was into that silence that the drums changed. Every soul in the cell heard it. The count that had rolled unbroken from the shaft towers of Karagvor for 3 days, 3 and 1, 3 and 1, faltering across the whole city at once, and then shifting. The shaft drummers of a nation switching, tower by tower, to a pattern none of the company knew, and every orc in the room went rigid at. Faster, doubled, urgent as a hammering heart. Gazra was already moving. Tarek Sai stood like the fortress taking a hit, and his hand was on the fang, and his voice, when it came, was the 5 gorges gone to war. That is the breach drum. The southern deep roads. The old king turned to the healer of 2 worlds, and 30 years of sealed ledgers burned down to this. The black water is in my tunnels. It is climbing toward my city, and your hammer, it seems, has decided not to wait for days. The cell emptied into the war in under a minute, Gazra bellowing muster orders down the spur stair, runners scattering across the chain bridges, the breach drum's doubled pattern rolling tier to tier. And in the middle of the flood, at the eye of it, the healer of 2 worlds stood with a king of canyons and a king of mountains and a chained scout, and dealt the hour the way she dealt every hour that did not negotiate, by protocol, at speed, with every hand assigned. Deep King Derm's engineers, the wagons, the long crate, whatever the guild's regards turn out to be, to the southern shaft heads now. They held a fever at a canal once, and they'll teach your wardens the water lines by morning. First Fang, your city needs what the Undervault learned. Light shows them, running water stops them, the count holds them, and the touched can be recalled. Hand, count, name. I'll drill your healers myself before the next bell. Doramir and the tier to whichever shaft the black climbs fastest. The fever listens to kin. She turned last to the pallet, to the old scout already holding out his chained wrists to the guards with one eyebrow raised at his own king of 30 years' distance. And Rowan Voss comes off the bench. He's the only soul on 2 worlds who's walked the enemy's schedule from the inside. Unchain my scout, king of the canyons, and give him a map table. If the hammer's gone early, it means we rattled him tonight, and a rattled Morvath makes mistakes he's never had to survive before. Tarek Sai looked at the small human woman ordering the defense of his nation in his own keep, and at his first fang, already obeying, and at the fang of the first morning warm against his own chest, and the old fortress of him made the sound of a ledger, somewhere deep, beginning at last to total. Unchain him, said the king of the canyons. And drummers, sound it to every tier. The healer's law holds below. Karagvor does not go quiet. Section 4. The canyons fought their war downward, the way the canyons did everything. With the stone, not against it. Where the Undervault had held a line at a canal, Karagvor held shafts, the great breathing holes of the deep road network, 100 of them threading the canyon city from tier to floor, and the black water climbing them was not a tide, but an infection rising through capillaries. The first 3 shafts went dark within an hour of the breach drum, their wardens retreating up the stone stairs ahead of a risen black that drank lamps and showed the wanting. And it was Derm's dwarves who answered first, because the Undervault had already fought this war and won. They had Lena's protocols running by the second bell, salt lines across the shaft heads, then the sluice work. Karagvor's own cisterns cracked open on Derm's engineer-barked orders, clean canyon water flooding the approach galleries, building the running water barriers the fever could not cross. The orc wardens learned the 3 weapons in the time it took to demonstrate them twice, because the orcs, Lena realized with a fierce professional pride, were the fastest tactical learners she had ever drilled. They fought in hand signs, they processed by doing, and the first Fang's warband took the lamp wall formation, the count relay, and the touch recall technique and turned them, inside a single shift, into a doctrine so efficient that Valus watched a shaft head defense unfold and said to the ceiling, with the closest thing to awe his flat voice had ever produced, "They are better at this than we were." "They have been fighting in tunnels for 300 generations, Gazra said from behind him, without turning. "You have been fighting in trees. Tunnels are harder." The city held. Not comfortably, 3 more shafts went dark in the second bell, and the black water was learning. It probed the sluice barriers for dry seams. It sent individual found-up ventilation cuts too narrow for wardens, and once, on the 7th tier, it rose inside a cistern, a cold moment that sent Ithreni sprinting with her vial before Lena could dispatch her. But the doctrine held, and the drums held, and the count held, and by the 3rd bell, the war had settled into the grim arithmetic of a siege. The city ringed in its own water, the shafts stoppered, the found standing in their silent hundreds below the salt lines, swaying to a rhythm they could not stop remembering. What the canyons added to the Undervault's doctrine was their own, and it was brutal and beautiful. The orc warbands did not simply hold the salt lines. They rotated in 6 warrior shifts, each shift carrying enough lamp oil for 2 bells and enough salt for 20 touch recalls, moving through the shaft head defenses with the silent hand sign efficiency of people who had been fighting in the dark since before the elves learned to sing. Where the dwarves had held by standing, the orcs held by flowing, a constant cycling of fresh light and fresh throats at every contact point, so that no warrior's count went hoarse and no lamp guttered for want of oil. and the found at every shaft head faced not a wall but a current, relentless, always refreshed. And they innovated. By the fourth bell, a warband captain on the 9th tier had worked out something Lena would immediately steal for the formal doctrine: salt water. The canyon cisterns mixed with the deep shaft salt deposits made a brine that could be bucketed onto the found in quantity, and the combination, shown and salted, the fever's two weaknesses combined in one throw, drove the black back down the shafts faster than lamp walls alone. Gazra, receiving the report, made the hand sign for promote without pausing her own shaft head circuit, and the brine tactic was rolling across all 40 held shafts by dawn. In the mountain, Doromir said, watching the 9th tier rotation with Valis. We would have built this doctrine in a season of Lore Master's study. They built it in a bell. In the mountain, Valis replied, the enemy is a story we tell. Here he is in the basement. Basements accelerate. A pause, and the flat voice did something it almost never did. It admitted respect for someone outside the company. We should learn their hand signs, Majesty, when this is done. Lena found Gazra between rotations, on the 5th tier's bridge, and the two women stood over the canyon's dark in what both of them recognized across every possible divide. The brief between rounds, when two shift partners check each other's instruments before the next bell. Your wolves in the south, Lena said. The 300 cut off. How long can they hold without the doctrine? Gazra's single eye went down into the dark between the bridges, toward the southern shafts where no drum had answered for 3 bells. My wolves are the finest tunnel fighters in the world, healer. They can hold anything, against anything, for exactly as long as their salt and their nerve last. The bronze tusks ground once. Their salt is the standard field supply, 12 watches if rationed. Their nerve is canyon bred and not in question. What is in question is what your friend said upstairs, the drilling. The quarantine floor is 500 steps below the deepest southern post. Between my wolves and the floor is everything the pool has been pouring into my roads for a season. And between the floor and the world sea is whatever thickness of stone 1,000,000 years of patience and 300 years of engineering has left. She looked at Lena, and the single eye held nothing back. My wolves will hold. Your surgery must be faster than stone. It was Rowan Voss, unchained and installed at a map table in the war circle under the open sky, who turned the arithmetic from endurance into attack. He was, Lena had to concede from across the war table, magnificent at this. 30 years of listening down the enemy's own hook had given the old scout something no intelligence in 2 worlds could match. Not facts, those went stale, but cadence. He knew how Morvath thought the way a doctor knows a patient's pulse, by rhythm, by deviation, by the things the rhythm did under stress that the patient could not help. And the rhythm, tonight, was wrong. He accelerated, Rowan said, moving salt grains across the sketched map with the steady hands of a man whose chains were off for the first time in a season. The breach was supposed to come after the column reached the canyon rim, a hammer and anvil, the march pinning the city while the pool rose to meet it. Instead, the pool moved early before the columns in position. That's not strategy. That's flinch. The scout's eyes came up, lit with the particular light of a man who has studied his torturer long enough to see the seams. He expected us to come willingly. That was the design. It's always the design. He has never once in 300 years imagined a universe in which the instrument declines to be used. When you told him the canyons declined to be spared, healer, you broke something in the schedule that had never been broken before. And his response, listen to me, because this is the only advantage we will ever have. His response was to push the timetable. That means he's committed. The engineers below the pool are on an accelerated dig, and they cannot stop. The infected reach is already being channeled into the drill path, and channeled fever does not unchannel. He is riding a wave he started early, and that wave has to break somewhere, and if it doesn't break through the quarantine floor into the world sea, it breaks upward, Lena finished. Into the canyons. Into us. Into whatever's standing on the lid when the pressure exceeds the stone, Rowan confirmed. He sat back from the map, and for a moment the briefing cadence dropped and the man underneath it spoke to the healer directly. Scout to doctor, 30 years of the dark to 34 years of the count. He flinched because you told him no. In 300 years of maneuvering, Neraveth, the bridge, the portal, the whole architecture of the slow and the patient, nobody has ever, to my knowledge, simply looked into his face and said, declined. You didn't offer an alternative. You didn't negotiate. You declined, as a doctor declines malpractice. And that, healer, is the thing he called me to his line 3 decades ago to prevent, and the thing he has arranged 2 universes to avoid. A human being who treats the end of the world as a clinical question and answers it with professional standards. The old eyes warmed. Lyriel told Doromir to bring you to me. I am beginning to think my sister, my friend, my teacher, my... The lit eyes flickered, and the word kept moved through them like weather. I am beginning to think she saw you coming long before the water did. Which gives us exactly one move, and it's the move he's terrified of, and it's the reason he offered you the deal in my cell. We go down. Not to fight the army. The army is the distraction, the theatrical half, and every warrior we spend against it is a warrior not at the floor. We go to the quarantine seal, where his engineers are drilling, and we do the thing you did in the undervault. We meet the fever at its neck, with the grafts and the count, and the one pair of hands the deep itself appointed. He looked at her across the salt grain map. The surgery, he interrupted, healer. The one the water asked for. It doesn't happen at the river. There isn't time for the river. There was never going to be time for the river, and I think the water has known that since it put the cup in your hands. The surgery happens here, at the bottom of the world's worst wound, in the dark. With his entire army above us and his engineers below? Doromir said quietly. Yes. The old scout did not soften it. He had learned unsoftened numbers from the best. That is why it requires a king with a sister graft, a healer with two, a scout with a hook the water can unhook at the hour of need, and... He looked across the war circle, at the fortress of a canyon king standing at the circle's rim with the fang warm at his throat. A tooth that has been biting down since the first morning and has never once let go. The open sky circle held the thought, and the breech drums rolled beneath it, and Tarek Sai of the Red Country did a thing Lena had only ever seen one other king do. He stepped out of the statecraft entirely and spoke as a man. You asked me to put the fang into the wound. Not an accusation, an inventory. To leave my city fighting on its lid while I walk down into the thing that eats my scouts. With the elf who owes me a ledger, and the human who declined to pity me, and the man my canyons have called the Grey Traitor for 30 years. The old eyes went to Rowan, and held there, and what moved in them was the banded, geological process of an entire nation's grudge being re-examined under new light. You sat in my cell and told my guards to chain you well, Grey One. You asked to be kept from my shafts. You surrendered your own freedom to protect my deep roads from the thing in your line. A beat, heavy as the canyon walls. In the canyons there is a word for the one who harms himself to hold a breach for others. It is not traitor. What is the word, King? Rowan asked quietly. Fang. Tarek Sai's hand closed around the tooth at his throat, and something in his fortress shifted, the final load settling, the last ledger entry totaled, and the king of the canyon spoke to the war circle and the drums and the sky. The fang of the first morning goes to the wound. With the healer's hands, the king's graft, the scout's line, and... He unclasped the chain with the deliberate care of a man setting down a weight he has carried since his own first morning. The canyon's tooth, not given, not surrendered, bitten through. If the healer of two worlds intends to operate on the foundation of everything, the canyons intend to be the jaw that holds the wound open while she works. He held the fang out, not to Lena, to the circle, to the sky, to the ledger of 10,000 years, and the clan's banners moved in the canyon wind, and the drums below the stone did not falter. One condition, one entry in the red ledger, and the condition is not negotiable. The deep-set eyes found Lena's. You have taught my shafts account. You have stopped ascending with your hands. You have brought an elf who corrects records and a scout who chains himself for my people's safety, and the canyon's books balance honestly for the first time in 30 years. That has bought the fang, but the fang goes to the wound on the back of a second debt, and the debt is this. The fortress voice dropped to the register of a father, speaking of sons. My southern shafts hold 300 scouts in the dark below the salt lines, cut off since the first breach. Your protocols keep the surface. Your protocols have not reached them. They are fighting down there, healer. My wolves, my best. Fighting blind, without the count, without the doctrine, and every bell I sit in this circle is a bell they are dying in the dark without their king. He set the fang on the map table, tooth and chain, warm gold white against the salt grain sketch. The path to the quarantine floor runs through the southern deep. You need to reach the seal. I need to reach my wolves. Same road, same enemy. And when we reach them, if we reach them, the fang goes to your surgery on the back of a nation that fights beside you, not for you. Skath, Lena said quietly, and heard the word land on the war circle like a bridge bell. Tarek Sai's tusks showed, and the geological event ran very far upstream. Someone, said the king of the canyons, has been teaching you our courtesies. Someone, said Lena, has been counting with me in the dark since Watchpost 1. You're late, Tarek Sai. She picked up the fang from the map with both hands, felt the third graft answer the second and the first in a warmth that ran from her palms to her throat and from her throat to the pack at her back, 3 droplets of the foundation of 2 worlds singing kin across her stethoscope and her salt pouches and her beads. But the canyons were never late to a fight. The canyons were waiting for someone to count them in. They opened the long crate at moonrise, in the muster yard of the lowest tier, and Durham stood over it with his arms folded and his drill bit eyes suspiciously bright and said only, "The guild's regards. For the canyons, when the floor opens. Inside, packed in forged straw, 800 dwarf-forged miner's lamps, not the ancestral hand lamps of the holds, but field lamps, iron-cased, storm-proofed, filled with double-wicked oil that burned hot and white enough to show the found at 60 paces, each one stamped with the sigil of the undervault. Alongside them, in a separate oilcloth wrapping, 800 salt crystal beads on bootlace cords, identical to the one a 7-year-old had tied at Lena's throat. The Count, Durm said, and the light. The Deep King's compliments to the Canyon King's wolves. The ice does not forget who covered its retreat. Gazra looked into the crate, and at the dwarves, and at the Ice and Canyon Alliance she had been born too late to see the first time, and the single eye went, very briefly, as bright as Durm's. 1100, she said. The mountain corrects the record in crystal, and the ice corrects it in lamps. The canyons will note that neither correction asked permission. The canyons will note, Tarek'Sai said from behind her, helmeted now, the fortress gone to war, that the note is overdue. Arm the wolves. The surgery descends at the first drum. They went down into the southern deep at the hour when the breech drums were loudest, because loud was cover, and cover was the only armor the quarantine floor would accept. The surgical team was the strangest company the Red Country had ever fielded. Lena at its heart, carrying 3 grafts, the cup at her back, the fang at her belt, the tear blazing at the throat of the king beside her, Doramir with 2 burning lamps, Valus with his bow, Ithreni with her satchel, Phelan with his ruined voice and his indestructible count, Rowan Voss, 70 years old, unchained, moving through the orc deep roads with the muscle memory of a scout who had spent 30 years in tunnels darker than these. And around them, chosen by the first Fang herself, 40 of the canyon's wolves, armed and salt-pouched, each one wearing a dwarf-forged lamp at their chest and a salt crystal bead at their throat, looking, Lena thought with a pride that startled her, exactly like what they were, not an army, a surgical team, from 3 nations, carrying the Count into the wound. The drums above them faded as they descended. The darkness took their place, and far below, growing with every step, rose the sound that Rowan had warned them of, not the fever's silence, not the Found's collective hunger, but something worse, the patient, rhythmic, professional drilling of things that had been engineers once, in the deep places of the world, before they learned to pick the lock of the living, working down, 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 toward the last clean stone between the infection and the foundation of everything. On the 50th step, Doramir fell back to walk beside Rowan, and what passed between them was quiet and quick, the way 2 soldiers talk on a march when the march is all the private they'll get. The toy bow. You saw me put it on the table. I saw. The old voice in the dark sounded like the old voice from the Remembrancer's memory, the one that had taught a 9-year-old the soldier's rule on an archery terrace. I didn't touch it. I haven't earned. Doramir said the word the way his father had said caution, assessing, discarding. You carried it through the end of the world for 30 years, and you're talking to me about earning. A silence, measured in steps. When this is done, when the water unhooks you, when the surgery closes, when we climb, it goes back in your hands, Rowan. Not as a gift, as a return. It was always yours. I was only minding it. Somewhere in the dark behind his beard, the old scout made a sound that was not entirely soldierly. You grew up, little prince. I had time. The king of the Kant Peaks, descending into the wound of the world, looked sideways at the first chosen of Sarethiel and said, I had a very good teacher. 2, as it turned out. 1 just needed 30 years to finish the lesson. How long? Lena asked in the dark, her voice flat and steady and aimed at the chart. Rowan Voss listened, head tilted, the old hook humming its dead line, reading the cadence of 300 years of enemy against the bedrock of 2 worlds. Hours, he said. If they don't sleep, and healer, they have never once slept. By dawn the floor is through and the spill begins, and every river on both sides of the world starts dying from the roots. The lit eyes came around, and in the glow of 3 grafts and 2 burning lamps and 40 wolf chest field lamps, the first chosen of Sarethiel gave the second the last true sentence of his 30-year scouting report. You wanted to know if the patient could be healed instead of closed. This is where you find out.
Section 5. They found the wolves by their teeth. 200 steps below the last working shaft, past salt lines that had been drawn and redrawn and drawn again across narrowing galleries in a retreating grammar of desperation, the surgical team walked into the sound of fighting, and fighting, in the canyon deep, sounded nothing like it sounded above ground. No war cries, no commands. The wolves of the southern shafts fought the way they breathed, on hand signs, in silence, in the dark, spending nothing the dark could use. What Lena heard, rounding the last gallery bend behind Gazra's raised fist, was the slap of brine on stone, the hiss of salt finding fever, and, underneath, steady as a surgical metronome, the rhythm of 40 fists on 40 chests, keeping a count nobody had taught them. They had invented it themselves. Gazra stopped so sharply that Doramir walked into her pauldron, and the first fang of the eastern passes stood in the gallery mouth and looked at 300 of her wolves holding a salt line in the black, in the ruin of their standard kit, lamps down to stubs, brine buckets nearly dry, armor stripped for mobility, every face grey with dust and salt crust, and the particular exhaustion that lives past the edge of endurance and into the country beyond it. And the sound that came out of the canyon's finest soldier was not a command, and not a greeting, and not, quite, a sob. It was the sound a shift partner makes when the relief arrives. "My wolves," Gazra said. Just those 2 words, and then a hand sign that cascaded down the line and turned 300 grey faces toward the gallery mouth, toward the 40 field lamps blazing on 40 fresh chests, toward the oil and the salt and the brine and the count. And Lena watched a nation's best see the cavalry and understand, in one collective intake, that the cavalry was wearing dwarf-forged lamps and elf crystal beads and the healer's own count on their fists. The wolves' captain was a scarred veteran named Kor, Rook's commander, Lena would learn, the one who had carried the boy up the shaft on her shoulders, and she crossed the salt line to meet Gazra with the economy of a woman who had been rationing everything, including words, for a week. First fang. Situation? The line holds, barely. The black has been probing for 3 days, concentrated, not random. It knows we're here. It's been herding us up, clearing the lower galleries by pressure, pushing us away from the deep sink. The scarred face tightened. We've been counting. We learned. There was a boy, first fang, our Rook, before we lost him upward. He found the count by accident, the way the best things are found, and we've kept it since, and it works. And I will put it in the formal doctrine with my own blood if anyone ever asks me to write another report. Her eyes found Lena behind the first fang's shoulder and widened. The stethoscope, the beads, the white coat, the impossible human, and the captain of the Southern Wolves said, in the flat canyon cadence, the single most gratifying sentence of Lena's medical career. "You're the one, the counter, the one the shafts are drumming for." A breath. "My wolves have been fighting with your medicine for a week, healer. It would be..." She paused, and the word polite was visibly discarded and replaced with the word accurate. "It would be accurate to say you saved us before you arrived." "Rook saved you," Lena said. "I just wrote it down. Captain, how far to the quarantine floor?" 300 steps, through the herded black, Kor's jaw set. "I can show you where the drilling started. We heard it 5 days ago, felt it 3 days ago, and it has been getting..." She stopped, head tilting, scarred ears reading the stone the way Durham's patrol had read the fen. But first, before the silence, before the descent, there was the arming of the wolves. And it was, Lena would think afterward, the moment the war stopped being an alliance of convenience and became a family. The 40 fresh wolves set down Durham's crate at the salt line, and Gazra opened it, and 300 grey-dusted veterans of a week in the dark looked at 800 field lamps and 800 salt crystal beads stamped with the sigil of a nation most of them had never seen, and the silence that followed was not the canyon's tactical silence. It was the silence of soldiers discovering they had not been forgotten. Kor picked up one lamp, turned it over, read the undervault's mark, and looked at Durham. At the dwarf, the first dwarf most of her wolves had ever stood within arm's reach of, and said, in the flat canyon cadence that was incapable of decoration, "Your hold made these." 800, Durham said. "The guild cut them in a night." The Deep King said, "The ice does not forget who covered its retreat." He meant the fen, 30 years ago. 1100 of your people died covering the hold's withdrawal, Captain, and the record called it 6 words, and a king of the mountain has pledged to correct it in the mountain's own stone. He stood square, drill-bit eyes in his storm-scoured face, and delivered the ice folks half of a 30-year debt in the manner of his people. He stated the balance. 800 lamps does not repay 1100 lives, but it is a start, Captain. It is the ice saying, "We count you." Kor looked at the lamp in her hand for a long time. Then she clipped it to her chest and struck the light, and 300 wolves reached into the crate, and the southern deep lit up. Lamp after lamp after lamp, a constellation assembling itself in the dark, each wolf threading a salt bead beside whatever tokens their own nation hung at the throat, until the gallery blazed with a light that was not elven, not dwarven, not orcish, but all three, the light of the count, rendered in the craft of every people who had decided at last to count together. Phelan, watching from the gallery mouth, said nothing. Then he struck his fist over his heart, twice, and 500 fists answered. "All right," said Kor, clipping her chin strap, and the flat cadence was a degree less flat than it had been a minute ago. 300 steps, the herded black parts for light or it doesn't. Either way, she looked at Lena, and the scarred face did the canyon geological event very far upstream. Skath, healer, your watch and mine. Everyone heard it at the same moment. The drilling had stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse than any sound the deep had made. It arrived like a pressure change, a pop in the bones, in the lungs, in the 3 grafts at Lena's body that went from warm to blazing in the space of a breath, and Rowan Voss, at her shoulder, went rigid for one heartbeat as the dead hook in his chest hummed with something that was not a message but a vibration, the resonance of a vast engineering project reaching its final frequency. "They've stopped because they're through," Rowan said flatly. "The last stone is membrane now, inches, not feet. They've left a skin. The spill is staged, healer. He doesn't break it from below, he breaks it from above, from the pool. The whole weight of 9 centuries of fever pressing down on a floor that's been drilled to paper. How long does paper hold?" The old scout listened to the humming in his chest, the dead line carrying one last involuntary signal, the engineer's own satisfaction conducted through the hook like current through a wire. "Until he gives the order. The column reaches the canyon rim by dawn. That's his anvil. The pool rises on his command. That's his hammer. When the column pins the city and the pool breaks the floor at the same hour, the spill goes down into the world sea and the fever goes up through every shaft in the canyons at once, and the world ends from both directions simultaneously. A breath, and the scout cadence cracked, just once, and what came through the crack was not fear, but the raw thing underneath it, the fury of a man who has watched the design from the inside for 30 years, and is finally, standing in front of it, with his hands free. "He is magnificent at this, healer. I have hated him for 3 decades, and I cannot stop admiring the architecture. But architecture has one flaw that counts. It needs the floor to hold until the architect is ready. And the architect," the lit eyes came around, "is not ready. We rattled him. He pushed the timetable. The column is still 6 hours from the rim. For 6 hours, the floor holds on its own schedule and not his. And 6 hours, in the hands of a surgeon who bought a dying king a season, is an ocean of time." "Then we move now," Lena said, and the surgical team, 10 from the company, 40 canyon wolves, 300 grey-dusted southern veterans who had fought for a week with medicine they'd built from a boy's accident, turned as one body toward the dark below.
The descent through the herded black was the longest 200 steps of the war. The wolves led, their country, their dark, their hand signs, and the black that had been pressing them upward for a week parted for the surgical column the way it had parted in the undervault's drowned mines, not yielding, funneling. Lena felt the architecture of it, the fever channeling them down, toward the staged membrane, toward the moment the weight broke through. And she also felt, riding beneath the dread like a second pulse, the thing the fever had not planned for. The 3 grafts at her body, answering each other. The tear at Doromir's throat, pulsing quick. The cup at her back, warm and humming. The fang at her belt, biting down with a patience older than the fever itself. 3 droplets of the foundation of the world, walking toward their oldest wound, and wherever they passed, the black thinned, not retreating, recognized. The fever was the deep gone wrong, and the grafts were the deep's own immune system, and the immune system was, at last, inside the body. Tarek Sai walked the column's center, and every wolf they passed knew him, by shape, by the dropped shoulder silhouette, by the absence of the fang at his throat that had been there since before any of them were born. He did not speak to them. The Canyon King had spent his whole reign not speaking at the right moments. He simply walked, visible, present, king in the dark where king belonged, and his wolves saw him and did the thing wolves do when the pack leader enters the field. They closed ranks, and they moved, and the whole descent picked up pace around a gravity that had been missing for a week. At the 150th step, in a gallery so narrow the column went single file, Kor fell back to walk beside her king. The exchange, in hand signs, took 4 gestures. Report, held, cost, acceptable. And then a 5th sign, one Lena had not seen in the canyon vocabulary, that Kor made slowly, and Tarek Sai answered by closing his eyes. Once, the blink of a fortress absorbing a hit. She told him how many they lost, Gazra murmured beside Lena, reading the signs. 43, in a week. The single eye went straight ahead, into the dark. He will carry those names the rest of his life. That is the sign for it, the carrying sign. It has no trade tongue word because no other people has the custom. When a canyon king loses wolves, he takes their names into his body and speaks them aloud every morning until his own name joins the list. 43 mornings, healer, every morning, for the rest of a reign. A pause, and the bronze tusks caught the graft light. That is why the canyons do not waste wars. Phelan kept the count, steady, wrecked, indestructible, and 500 wolves kept it with him, fist to chest, and the sound of it rolling down through the herded dark was a sound no ear in the deep had heard in 900 years. The count of the living, descending into the keeping that had gone wrong, carrying no weapon but the rhythm of being present and shown and seen, and the black water on every side shivered with it the way a fever shivers when the cold cloth arrives. It knows. Deep Father, no, not Deep Father. Deep Father was 1,100 steps above them under a mountain of ice, but the cup at Lena's back was Deep Father's vessel, and through it, thin as a canal whisper, the clean Deep's voice threaded, "It knows you are coming, Green Eyes. It has been dreaming of your hands for longer than your father has. Do not be gentle. Gentleness is for the keeping that works. What waits at the floor has forgotten how to be kept, and it must be reminded, and reminding hurts, and you must do it anyway. That is why a healer and not a soldier. Soldiers end things. Healers remind them what they were." They came out of the last gallery onto the quarantine floor, and the world opened downward. The chamber that held the membrane was not a chamber at all. It was a throat, the geological neck between the infected pool and the world sea, a natural funnel of ancient stone 50 feet across at its widest, and the surgical column emerged onto its upper rim like a crowd arriving at the rail of an amphitheater built for gods. Below them, at the funnel's base, lay the membrane, the last seal between the wrong keeping and the right one, and it was beautiful, which was the cruelest thing about it. The membrane was a disk of stone 50 feet across, the natural seal between the infected pool above and the world sea beneath, and it was alive, not with the fever's black, with both. From above, the pool pressed down, a ceiling of dark water, glass still, the weight of 9 centuries bearing on the engineered thinness with visible patience, the surface of it roiling in slow shapes that formed and unformed. Engineers, keepers, the crossing-born, the working faces of the oldest enemy, all of them pressed flat against the membrane's upper surface like faces at a window, watching the surgical team arrive from below. And from beneath, from the hairline fractures the drilling had opened, from the veins and seams of the last stone, light. The clean Deep's light, pressing up, the world sea reaching for its own wound the way a body's blood reaches for a cut, and the membrane between them groaning, softly, enormously, the sound of a planet's oldest suture under two-directional stress. Lena descended to the membrane's level, and her feet on the stone sent a vibration through the whole disk that she felt answered, instantly from both sides. From above, a surge of dark attention. From below, a pulse of warmth that traveled up through her boots and her calves and her spine and settled at the 3 grafts on her body like a hand closing around a held hand. The clean Deep knew she was here. It had, she understood, been holding this membrane's integrity by main strength for 900 years. The whole world sea pressing up against the infection's weight the way her hands had pressed against a dying king's frost. And it was tired, and the tiredness was everywhere in the stone, in the thread-like fractures, in the groan that never stopped. If you have ever felt a structure holding, a beam, a dam, a wall, a body, and known in your hands that it was holding by will and not by strength, you know what Lena felt in that stone. And you know why she did not wait for the briefing to finish before she knelt. The engineer's work was visible in the stone, drill paths radiating from a central bore like the spokes of a wheel, each one thinning the membrane to translucency, so that the whole disk was a web of stone and light and weight, and at its center, the bore, the final point, the paper-thin last inch, a circle of stone no wider than Lena's spread hands, glowing from below and dark from above, through which the foundation of 2 worlds and the infection of 9 centuries stared at each other across a distance measured in heartbeats. "There," Rowan said quietly, pointing at the bore. "That's his trigger. When the pool's weight exceeds that circle's strength, or when he gives the order and the engineers above apply the final pressure, the membrane goes, and the spill begins. Healer. Whatever you're going to do, that circle is your operating table." Lena walked to the center of the quarantine floor, to the bore, to the paper-thin circle where everything converged, and looked down through the stone at the clean Deep's light reaching up and up through the stone at 9 centuries of fever pressing down, and felt in her hands, in the 3 grafts humming against her body, in the count rolling behind her from 500 throats, the whole weight of the question the enemy had asked and the water had asked and the prophet had asked and her own dead father had asked, the question that had been waiting at the bottom of everything since a woman in a hospital had whispered, "Now it is your turn. Close or heal." She knelt at the bore. She placed her hands on the stone, palms flat, the way she placed them on a chest, the way she had placed them on a king's frost-written heart, the way she had placed them on a pallet in the Red Country and said, "No one starts the funeral while I'm still working." And the membrane answered. Under her palms, Between the pressing dark and the rising light, the stone hummed with the whole deep's attention, the clean water and the wrong water both turning, for the first time in 900 years, toward the same pair of hands. "I'm going to need the tear," she said. "And the cup, and the fang, all three, on the stone, now." Doromir knelt beside her without a word. He lifted the tear from his neck, the crystal that had pulsed at his father's throat for 400 years, at his own for a season, the first graft, the eldest droplet, and set it on the membrane's bore with steady hands. It blazed. Lena set the cup beside it, the golden vessel that had held the deep's own water level for 11 years in a dead king's hands. Second graft, the dwarf's own keeping, and the bore hummed. And Tarik-Sai, king of the canyons, knelt on the stone of his own deep country, and placed the fang of the first morning against the bore, the tooth that had bitten down since the world was soft and never once let go. Third graft, the canyon's whole theology, and the membrane sang, one low vast note that was not sound but recognition, three kin droplets touching the body they had been cut from, and the light below the bore flared cathedral white, and the dark above it surged cathedral black, and the paper-thin stone between them held on nothing now but the count and the hands and the question. 3 of 5. 2 still out in the world, the giant's olive, the enemy's crystal. But 3 were here, and 3 was enough to begin. 3 was enough to remind. Phelan. Her voice, the flat steady line of it. The count. Don't stop for anything. Wolves, you know the rhythm. Lamps up. And everyone in this chamber who has ever been shown, or kept, or counted, or pulled back from ascending, hold. 500 fists struck 500 chests, and the surgery at the bottom of the world began. And far above, through 500 steps of herded dark, through the shafts of a canyon city under siege, through the ash-choked dawn of a marching army's final approach, Morvath of the Terima felt the membrane hum and knew what it meant, and gave the order. The pool began to press. Section 6. The surgery began the way every surgery begins, with the assessment the textbooks never teach you, the half-second when the surgeon looks at the wound and the wound looks back, and both of them learn what the other is made of. Lena knelt at the bore with her palms on the paper-thin stone and 3 grafts blazing beside her, and she read the membrane the way she read a chest, by vibration, by temperature, by the deep diagnostic touch that 12 years and 2 worlds had trained into her fingers. From below, the clean deep pressed its light up through the fractures. Warm, enormous, patient, pushing with the steady pressure of a body's own immune response, a world sea trying to reach its wound the way platelets reach a cut. From above, the pool leaned down with 9 centuries of weight, dark, vast, and no longer patient at all, because Morvath's order had arrived through whatever architecture the crossing-born obeyed, and the pressure was increasing, bell by bell, the faces at the membrane's upper surface pressing flatter, hungrier, the engineered drill paths beginning to flex under load. The membrane groaned. A hairline fracture at the bore's eastern edge widened by a hair's breadth, and a thread of dark water slid through it and met a thread of light rising from below, and where they touched, Lena watched it happen from 6 inches away, her stethoscope pressed to the stone. Both threads recoiled. Not from each other exactly. From the meeting. As if 2 halves of the same substance, 9 centuries estranged, had touched and found the touch unbearable. "There," said the clinical voice that never slept. "That's the disease, not the infection, the estrangement. 900 years, and the wrong water has forgotten its water. It doesn't want to go home. It wants to go through." "Talk to me," she said aloud, to the stone, to the deep, to the grafts, and the 3 droplets answered, each in their own register. The tear pulsing its 10,000-year elven heartbeat, the cup humming its warm dwarven note, the fang vibrating with a frequency so deep it was more felt than heard, the canyon's own basal tone, the sound of biting down and never letting go. 3 voices, 3 nations' worth of the deep's own tissue, banked against this hour. And Lena Marlowe, who had spent a season learning that she was the lamp and the count and the hands the deep had chosen, understood at last, kneeling on the operating table of 2 worlds, what the surgery actually required. Not cutting, not sealing, not even in the end, the grafts themselves. It required introduction. The wrong water had forgotten it was water. The right water could not cross the estrangement alone. 9 centuries of trying had proven that. The membrane existed because the clean deep needed it, needed the barrier to keep the infections forgetting from spreading into the foundation itself. But the grafts were neither clean nor wrong. They were both, droplets of the original deep, carried by the living for 10,000 years, steeped in the warmth and the grief and the stubbornness of every race that had held them. A tear wept by a tree and worn by kings, a cup held level for 11 years by dead hands, a tooth bitten down in the first morning and never released. They were the deep as the living had loved it. And that, Lena realized with the vertigo of a diagnosis arriving whole, was what neither water could provide on its own. The clean deep was vast and patient and kept everything, but it kept alone. Morvath's poisoned truth, the one she had filed pending verification, landing now with its full weight at the worst possible time. And the wrong water was vast and hungry and kept nothing whole. Between them, estrangement. A wound that would not close because closing required two sides to recognize each other, and recognition required a translator, and the translator required hands, her father's voice said from the cup's warm glow. Hands that have held both sides. That's you, my girl. That was always you. She placed her right hand on the tear and her left on the fang and leaned forward until her forehead touched the cup's golden rim, and the three grafts sang, not with sound, with the warmth of 10,000 years of being held by the living, the whole accumulated worth of every hand that had ever clasped them. And the song went down through the bore into the clean deep, and down through the fractures into the wrong water, and for the first time in 900 years, two estranged halves of the same body heard themselves described by the same voice. The membrane shivered, and the pool pressed harder. The surgery's first hour was a war fought in millimeters. Every fracture in the membrane was a front line, dark pressing down through the drill paths, light pressing up through the natural seams, and Lena at the bore conducting the three-graft song into both, reminding, the clean deep had said, and the reminding hurt, and she did it anyway. Where the song reached, the estrangement thinned, the recoiling threads of dark and light, touching again, shuddering again, but holding the touch a fraction longer each time, a fraction, the way two hands that have been apart learn to clasp by degrees, finger by finger, because the full grip all at once would break what the separation has made brittle. The wolves held the perimeter, and holding, in the membrane chamber, meant something new, not fighting the black back but channeling it. As the graft song thinned the estrangement at each fracture, the wrong water above responded, not with rage but with panic, the panic of a fever that feels the cold cloth and does not understand that the cold cloth is mercy. Dark surges pulsed down through the weakened drill paths like blood through a clot, and the wolves met each surge the way Kor had drilled them in a week of the dark. Brine and lamps and the count, always the count, 3 and 1, showing the surge its own face until it slowed and swayed and remembered, briefly, horribly, what it had been before the estrangement taught it to want. Those moments of remembering were the worst sound in the chamber. A collective moan from the dark water itself, 900 years of the wrong-keeping recognizing, for one passing heartbeat, that the thing it had become was not the thing it was, and the recognition hurting in a place no lamp could reach. This is what healing sounds like, Lena thought, with her hands full of two worlds vibration and her eyes full of millimeters. Not the absence of pain, the presence of honesty. The wound being told the truth about itself, by someone willing to stay in the room while it hears it. 500 lamps, 500 fists, the count rolling around the membrane chamber in a relentless pulse that steadied Lena's own hands the way the drumming of the undervault had steadied the channel. And above them, pressing, the pool spent its weight in surges, each one flexing the membrane closer to its limit, each one sending new dark threads down through the cracks that the song had to meet and introduce and hold. It was not enough. Lena knew it by the second hour. The math was the math. 3 grafts, 1 pair of hands, a membrane 50 feet across and failing at 100 points at once, and one surgeon, however chosen, however lit, however stubborn, could not be in 100 places at the same time. The song thinned as it spread. The introductions took hold at the bore and frayed at the edges, and the pool, obedient to its distant master, pressed and pressed and pressed, and the membrane's groan deepened by a register that made the wolves' teeth ache and the lamps gutter. Healer. Rowan's voice at her shoulder, flat and urgent. The floor's losing. You need more hands, or fewer fractures. I need the pool to stop pressing. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the vibration, the 3 grafts conducting the deep's whole attention through her bones. If I had 10 minutes without the weight, just 10, the introduction takes hold, the threads stop recoiling, the membrane stabilizes from the inside. But he won't give me 10 minutes. He's up there. Yes, said Rowan Voss. He is. The quality of the old scout's voice changed. Lena heard it. The shift from briefing cadence to something older, something that had been waiting in the weathered throat for 30 years. The voice of a man who has carried a letter 400 times unfinished and knows, at last, exactly how it ends. The hook, Rowan said quietly. The line. It goes from my heart to his hand. A channel, healer. The oldest working channel between 2 points in this war. And Lyriel said, the water can unhook me if the enemy isn't listening. The hour when he's too occupied to listen. He knelt beside her at the bore, and his lit eyes were calm, and kind, and absolutely certain. What if I don't wait for the water to come to me? What if I go to him, down the line, through the hook, one last knock on a door that listens both ways, not to fight, to occupy. 30 years I've been his draft horse. I know every room in that house, healer, every corridor, every lock. If I go down the line and keep him busy in his own architecture for 10 minutes, You'll die, Lena's voice cracking. Rowan, the hook is in your heart. If you stress the channel that hard, the filament contracts and the water unhooks me at the other end. The old scout smiled, and it was the smile from the memory stone, exhausted, clever, kind, the smile of the man who had taught a little prince to shoot and a princess to laugh. Lyriel's terms, healer, not mine. The water cannot open the door to me while he's listening, but if I am in his house when the door opens, the hook pulls from his side, not mine, and what comes home down the line is... The smile deepened. Kept. She's waiting on the shore, remember? Arms already open. Rowan. Doromir's voice behind them, the sound of a man watching his brother volunteer for the edge again. Rowan, you don't have to... Little prince. The old soldier reached back without looking and found Doromir's hand and held it one grip, 3 and then 1, the count of a family that had finally stopped being broken. I have always had to. The letter's been waiting 30 years for its last line, and I have been waiting 30 years to stop reaching and start arriving. Let me arrive, Doromir. It's the only soldiering I have left. Doromir held the weathered hand, and the tear at his throat blazed in answer to something only the blood of Erling could feel. The deep's own approval, washing up through the membrane's light, confirming what the evening star already knew. Then arrive, brother, said the king of the Kant Peaks, and the word brother landed on the stone of the quarantine floor with the weight of 2 grafted branches and 1 mended bridge. Arrive and tell Lyriel, from me, from father, from the mountain entire, the chair is retired, we kept the lamps, she'll understand. I know she will. The old scout's grip tightened, released, and the soldier in him filed the farewell exactly where it belonged, under completed, and turned back to the surgery, and the road, and the last line. Lena looked at the old man, at the chart she had read in a lamplight cell, the cathedral of the hook fused to a 70-year-old heart, the line that could not be cut without killing, and saw, with the clarity that comes only at the bore of the world, the diagnosis she had been refusing. The hook was not a disease. It was a road. Morvath had built it as a chain. Rowan had survived it as a prison. But the deep that kept everything, the deep that was currently pressing its light up through a failing floor toward the hands of its chosen surgeon. The deep saw roads the way it saw rivers. Things that flow and can be flowed.
Ithreni, Lena said. The vial, everything we have left, on his heart, now. She turned to Rowan, and her hands were steady, the steadiest they had been all night, because the chart had resolved, and the chart was her country. You're not going down that line alone, Rowan. The grafts go with you, not physically, through the membrane. When you open the door from the inside, the 3-graft song travels the hook into his architecture, and the deep follows, and everything he built out of stolen keeping script meets the author of the script for the first time in 300 years. She looked down at the bore, at the paper-thin stone, at the light pressing up and the dark pressing down. I don't close wounds, Rowan. I don't seal patients away from their own tissue. I introduce the wrong water to the right water, the stolen words to the language they were cut from, the lockpickers to the house they were locked out of. Close or heal. The enemy is right to be afraid of the difference. And the difference is? Rowan asked, one hand on Doromir's, one hand rising to his own chest, to the cathedral of the hook, to the road. Lena Marlowe, second chosen of Sareth, healer of 2 worlds, kneeling on the operating table of the foundation of everything, answered the only question on the board. Closing says, stay out. Healing says, come home, and be what you were. She placed her hands back on the grafts, and the song rose, and the membrane's groan shifted key. I'm not closing the wound, Rowan. I'm opening the door the Terima asked for 10,000 years ago, the one the water should never have locked. And when it opens, everything his people stole comes home, and every crystal shatters, and every scream returns to the keeping, and the wound that was cut in grief heals in grief's answer, which is the same thing it's always been. Her voice broke and mended, 3 and then 1. 9 minutes with the people you love, held in water that does not let go. Rowan Voss closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were the memory stone's eyes one final time, and the last line of the letter, unfinished for 30 years, wrote itself across his face. Tell the little prince I'm arriving, he said, and tell Lyriel. The hand at his chest pressed flat, and the hook hummed, and the line opened, and the old scout's voice went very far away and very close at once. Tell her I'm still reaching. He went down the line like a river, finding its bed. The hook blazed, white, incandescent, the cathedral of stolen script lighting up from the inside as the first chosen of Sareth ran the enemy's own architecture the way he had once run the eastern passes, 30 years of scouting burning in a single sprint, and the 3 grafts at Lena's hands answered the blaze with their own 10,000-year song, and the song traveled the road, and the road opened, and somewhere far above, somewhere in a fortress of fused obsidian, in the ash, at the head of a marching column, Morvath of the Terima felt, for the first time in 300 years, a door open inside his own house, and the pool stopped pressing. 10 seconds. 20. The weight lifted, not gone. Diverted, the enemy's attention wrenched inward by an old soldier making noise in every room he'd been forced to memorize. And Lena, in those 20 seconds, did what she had promised 2 worlds she would do. She healed. The 3 graft song, unweighted, blazed down through the bore and out through every fracture of the membrane at once, not closing the cracks but filling them, not sealing the estrangement but dissolving it. And where the song reached, the dark water and the light water touched. And this time they did not recoil, because this time they were being introduced by hands that had held both sides, and the introduction said, "You are the same thing, and you were never not the same thing, and coming home hurts, and home is still here." The membrane began to glow, not from below, not from above, from within, the stone itself, the ancient seal, lighting up along every fracture line and every drill path as the 2 waters met inside it and remembered each other. And the remembering was not gentle, and was not kind, and was exactly what 900 years of estrangement earned, a reunion that shook the whole throat of the world, that made the wolves brace and the lamps swing, and the count falter and catch and hold, because the count always held, because the count was the oldest thing, and the surgery needed it now, the way a heart needs rhythm. And from far above, through a hook that was becoming a road that was becoming a river, came the sound of Rowan Voss laughing in the enemy's empty house, and the sound of stolen words going home, and the sound, faint, distant, enormous, of crystals beginning to crack. Ithreni heard it first, because Ithreni always heard the medicine before the war. "The graft song," she said, eyes widening, second surgeon reading the field. "It's not just in the membrane anymore, it's traveling the hook, it's in his architecture, it's in every crystal his network has ever forged. Healer, the song is in the enemy's own keeping script, and the script is recognizing its author." Through the seed stone at Lena's throat, thin as a cobweb across half a continent, the remembrancer's voice, breaking protocol for the 3rd time in the war, and what she said was 2 sentences that rewrote the surface of the world. "The white flowers have opened again, and Healer, on the mountain, in the throne hall, in the vault of the memory stone itself, something is singing. The stone says it is the language of the keeping, and it says it is coming from below the world, and every crystal in Kanthalar that was ever forged in the old script is cracking. We can hear them in the walls. The mountain is full of small sounds, like ice in spring, and from the south, thin, relayed through shaft drums and wolf howl and the canyon's own vast stone throat, came the report that Karagvor's war circle would receive at dawn, and Lena would not hear until the surgery was done. Across the ash column, across the marching army's own front line, a wave of breakage was rolling through the ranks. Red crystals, shattering on their spear tips, 1, then 10, then hundreds, each one releasing a thin thread of light that arced down, down, through the stone, through the deep roads, toward the membrane where a healer knelt. And the found in the canyon shafts, swaying to the count, began, one by one, then terrace by terrace, to thin, to go translucent, to release their dark, the way the colossus in the undervault had released its dark, kneeling, and what poured out of them, down through the salt lines, down through the deep, was not black water. It was words, the deep's own stolen vocabulary, 9 centuries and 300 years of extracted keeping script, flowing home through the stone like ink returning to a pen. Rowan's laughter, from very far away and very close, the laughter of a man running through a house that was coming apart around him, door after door blowing open, lock after lock admitting the author of the locks, and then his voice, one last time, carried up through the hook become river, with the tenderness of a man who has found the end of his sentence at last. Still reaching, Lyriel. Still reaching. The hook dissolved. The filament that had lived in Rowan Voss's heart for 30 years went to light. All of it, root to tip, cathedral to thread, and the light flowed down the line, and the line flowed into the membrane, and the membrane, which had been groaning for hours under the weight of two worlds, went silent. Not the silence of breaking, the silence of holding. Section 7. The silence of holding lasted 11 heartbeats. Lena counted because the count was the one constant left, and then the membrane stopped being stone. It happened the way dawn happens, not all at once, but past a line that everyone recognized after. The glow that had been building in the fractures and the drill paths intensified, spread, merged, until the entire 50-foot disk was no longer dark above and light below, but a single unified luminance, the stone itself becoming translucent, becoming water, the two estranged halves of the deep meeting inside their ancient seal, not as a collision, but as a reconciliation so total that the barrier between them simply dissolved, the way a scab dissolves when the skin beneath it has finished remembering how to be whole. The membrane became a window, and through it, from below, from the world sea, from the foundation of two universes, the clean deep rose, not a flood, not a surge, a tide, immense, deliberate, glowing, entering the pool above the way a parent enters a room where a child has been crying for 900 years, not with fury, not with force, but with the crushing, unbearable gentleness of something that has been listening to the crying through a wall and can finally open the door. The wrong water met the right water, and the meeting was not the recoiling of the fractures. The song had done its work, the introduction had taken. The black thinned to grey, the grey thinned to pearl, the pearl thinned to light, and the pool, 9 centuries of fever, of wanting, of the deep's own immune system gone to rot, began, slowly, in vast patient spirals, to remember what it was. The wolves saw it from below, the ceiling of their war going translucent above them, the dark water clearing like a bruise fading in fast forward, the engineered faces of the crossing-born losing their shape as the water that had rendered them forgot how to render, forgot how to want, forgot everything except the oldest instruction the deep had ever given itself. Keep worth, and keep it whole, and keep it still, and started, at last, to obey. Lena knelt at the bore and felt it happen through her palms. The vibration-changing register, the groan of two-directional stress easing to a hum, the hum easing to something she had felt only once before in her life, on a shore, at the bottom of the world, holding her father's luminous hand. The deep's own pulse, steady, vast, content. "It's working," Ithreni said, from somewhere behind her, in the voice of a second surgeon who has seen the blood clear and the vitals stabilize. "Healer, the pool is clearing. The whole column of water above us is—" The first crystal broke through from above. It came down through the clearing water like a falling star, a shard of red, trailing its thin thread of stolen light, tumbling through the transforming pool and landing on the membrane window inches from Lena's knee. And as it touched the surface that was no longer stone, the graft light received it, read it, and dissolved it. The stolen script returning to the author's hand, the locked word unlocking into the language it had been cut from. And Lena felt the deep shudder with the receiving, the way a body shudders at an IV's first warmth after long cold. Then 100 more fell, then 1,000. The sky above the membrane became a rain of red, crystal fragments cascading down through the healing water from the surface world, from the canyon's shafts and the fens roads and the mountain's walls, every stolen keeping word in Morvath's 300-year treasury coming home in a crimson downpour. And each one the deep received, and each one the graft song read, and each one returned a word to the language, and a scream to the keeping, and a kept soul to the shore that waited with its arms open. Merlin, Lena thought, with the rain falling red around her, and the deep shuddering beneath her hands. Neriveth's daughter, screaming in a spear tip for 30 years. If the Muzrak has broken, if the thread has run home, the seed stone at her throat pulsed once, warm as a held hand. And through it came no voice this time, only a single image relayed from a shore house half a world west. Lady Neriveth of the southern shores, standing knee-deep in the canal outside her window, in the running water, in the dark, with her old arms open and her sea-glass eyes closed and her mouth shaping a name the relay could not carry, but did not need to. Lena wept, and the count held, and the rain of crystals fell like the world's longest held breath, finally, blessedly, letting go. And through the clearing water, thin as candlelight through glass, came one more image, not from the seed stone this time, but from the membrane itself, from the deep's own gratitude rendered in the healing pool's new transparency, a shore, glowing, familiar, impossibly far below, and on it, two figures of luminous water standing where the waves did not move. One was slight and silver-haired, laughing the bright, helpless laugh that a stare had filed with a librarian's care. The other was broad-shouldered, grey-uniformed, rope-lean, rendered in light now, not in dark, not in ash, whole and kept and arrived, and his hand was in hers, and neither of them was reaching any more, because there was nowhere left to reach. Doramir saw it. Lena saw Doramir see it, saw the king of the Kant Peaks look down through the healing wound of two worlds at his sister and his brother standing together on the shore of everything, 30 years and one bridge finally crossed, and watched his face do the thing his father's face had done in a cedar chair at the end of a spent hour, break and mend in the same breath, grief and joy sharing the same muscle, the way they always had in the family that grew foreign branches. He arrived, Doramir said quietly, to the membrane, to the shore, to 30 years of hunting in the wrong direction. He finished the letter. Below, on the glowing strand, the broad-shouldered figure turned, as if he heard, through all the water, through the healing and the kept and the whole depth of the world between them, and raised one hand, not a wave. The old gesture from crowded places, "I'm here. I found you." And the slight figure beside him raised hers, and the laugh carried up through the translucent pool like a memory held so long it had become music, and the deep, content, at last, let the image fade. Morvath's answer came at dawn. They heard it from below, felt it rather, through the membrane window and the clearing pool and the 500 steps of stone above, the breech drums of Karagvor doubling, tripling, a whole city's alarm system going to its highest register at once, and through the seed stone the remembrancer's relay crackled with transmissions from a dozen shaft heads, all saying the same thing in different voices. The column has reached the rim. He is coming over the edge, not the found, him. Morvath of the Terima, high sorcerer, 300 years of patience and architecture, and the most elegant evil two worlds had ever produced. Morvath was coming down, personally, through the canyons, through the shafts, toward the membrane. His crystal network was shattering around him, his stolen vocabulary was bleeding home, his army of holes was thinning in the rain of red, as every spear tip that had held them surrendered its word. And the Deathless, at last, was doing the thing he had never once in 3 centuries been forced to do. He was improvising. "He has no crystals left," Rowan's voice. No, not Rowan's voice. Rowan was gone, was arriving, was kept and reaching and home. It was Valis who said it, reading the transmissions with a soldier's cold arithmetic. No network, no remote control, no whisper shards. His army is dissolving. The found are thinning at every shaft head. The crossing-born are losing their shapes. He has nothing left but himself and whatever he can carry in his own body. The scarred jaw tightened. Which, healer, is 300 years of accumulated keeping craft, personally held. And I respectfully suggest that nothing left but himself is not the comfort it sounds like. How long until he reaches us? Lena's hands were still on the membrane. She could not lift them, not now, not yet. The reconciliation was still spreading through the pool, the two waters still learning to be one, and if she broke contact before the healing stabilized. "He will come through the southern deep roads," Tariksai said, already moving, already commanding, the fortress going to its final war. "Through my wolves, if they cannot hold him. Core, the southern perimeter. Every lamp, every salt line, every breath of the doctrine. He is not an army, he is one. Hold one." The old king turned to Lena, and the fang's absence at his throat was a wound he wore like a banner. "How long does the healing need, healer?" "Hours." She hated the answer. "The pool is clearing, but it's not healed. The deep's still spreading through 9 centuries of wrong, and if I lift my hands before it reaches the bottom of the infection, the estrangement reforms, and everything Rowan bought us. Then you do not lift your hands." Tariksai drew his blade, old iron, canyon-forged, the blade of a king who had never once asked anyone to fight where he would not stand. "The canyons hold one man for as many hours as one healer needs. That is the debt, and the debt is paid for, and the ledger—" The fortress voice aimed at 500 wolves and the stone they fought on. "The ledger balances tonight." What followed, Lena would piece together afterward from shaft drum relays and wolves' reports and the flat testimonies of soldiers who had been very bored for 30 years and were not bored now. the defense of the southern deep roads against the last working of the oldest enemy in the world. He came down through the canyons the way a river comes down through canyons, finding every crack, every seam, every weakness the stone offered, and he was no longer wearing borrowed shapes. The crossing-born, dissolving around him as their crystal anchors shattered and rained, had given up their stolen forms and pulled back into the one form that had never been stolen, his own, and his own was vast. 300 years of personally accumulated keeping craft, held in a single body that had not been human for a very long time, wearing the black like a second atmosphere, the dead spear in his hand still trailing the last red threads of a crystal that was coming apart at the molecular level as the deep's own script recognized its author and defected. The wolves met him at the 9th junction, Kor's position, the scarred captain's own ground, and the doctrine hit him full. 500 lamps, the count, the brine, every weapon the war had forged. And for the first time in the history of the Canyons War, the doctrine held a single target and could not move it. He did not stop. He did not slow. He did not sway to the count the way the found swayed. The count was medicine for the stolen, and nothing in Morvath of the Torima had ever been stolen. It had all been taken, deliberately, with 3 centuries of craft, and the taking had been built to withstand exactly this. The lamps showed him. He did not flinch from being shown. He had chosen what he was, eyes open, and 300 years of choosing does not shiver at lamplight. The brine touched him. He bore it the way the canyon stone bore rain. And the count, Phelan's count, the healer's law, the count reached him, and he listened to it the way a conductor listens to an orchestra he intends to disassemble. Wolves fell back from the corridor in disciplined retreats. Kor's rotations, perfect under pressure, buying minutes with each junction yielded. And 3 of them fell and did not get up, not taken, but burned. The ambient power of 3 centuries of accumulated craft, scorching the air in the narrow galleries the way a forge scorches the smith who stands too close. Ithren worked the casualties at each fallback point, vial and hands and the medicine of 2 worlds, while the retreat brought the membrane what it needed most, time and time and time. The doctrine holds him alone, Kor reported at the 6th junction, flat as canyon stone, blood on her salt crust. The doctrine cannot stop him. He walks through it the way the canyon walks through weather, first fang. He is very old, and he has been choosing this for very long, and I respectfully report that the count is not medicine for the willing. Interesting, said the voice like ash on snow, walking through 500 of the Red Country's finest without breaking stride, walking toward the membrane and the healer and the healing. You have built something genuinely new. I will keep the pattern, healer. When this is done, I will teach it to better students. Tarek Sai met him at the last junction before the membrane chamber. King to sorcerer, iron to craft, canyon to ash, and the king of the Red Country, who had worn the fang since his first morning and given it away for the surgery, and fought now with nothing but a blade and a body, and 43 names he would speak every morning for the rest of his life. Tarek Sai planted himself in the corridor and held, not with steel, though steel was there, with weight, the fortress of him, the dropped shoulder and the rebuilt frame and the 90 years of canyon stone, standing in the path of 3 centuries the way a dam stands in the path of weather. And Morvath, who had walked through every defense the age could build, stopped. Not because the dam could hold him, because the dam was talking. You asked the healer a question, Tarek Sai said, blade across the corridor, boots in the stone dust of his own deep country. Close or heal, I heard it from a cell, through a stolen throat, in my own keeping. And I have carried it down 500 steps to give you the canyon's answer, because the canyons always answer, sorcerer, always. The old king's deep-set eyes, in the lamplight, in the last corridor, at the last minute of the last hour. Healing means you come home, you and yours, the lockpickers, the grief-born, the people the water refused. The door the healer is opening opens for you too, old man. That is what healing means. And if you walk through me to stop it, you will be the one soul in the history of the deep who was offered home and chose the ash instead. And the canyon's ledger will carry that entry, and the canyon's ledger does not lie, and the canyon's ledger lasts. For 3 heartbeats, Lena felt them through the membrane, through the stone, through the whole shuddering body of the healing world. Morvath of the Torima stood still in the corridor, and the ash on snow voice was silent. Then, you are asking me to trust the water. I am asking you to trust the healer, Tarek Sai said. The water locked you out. She is the one who unlocked it. and she is the one, sorcerer, the only one in 10,000 years, who asked the water why and demanded the answer out loud in front of witnesses, because that is her standard of care. You built 30 years of the world to make one instrument. She has spent 30 years making herself one, and her instrument does not hoard. The last red thread of the spear crystal dissolved in Morvath's grip. The dead spear stood in his hand like a question mark. And far below them, at the membrane, Lena Marlowe felt the pool's last spiral of wrong water clear, felt the deep's tide reach the bottom of 9 centuries of infection and begin, at last, to turn, and lifted her hands from the stone of the operating table for the first time in hours, and the membrane held, and the healing held, and the world held. And from the space between the worlds, from the crack where she had hidden for 300 years, Sareth stepped onto the membrane's glowing surface. Not through mirror or pool or dream, in person, translucent, glass-eyed, luminous with the light of 2 directions, the prophet between the worlds arriving at the one place where the between had finally become thin enough to stand on, the healed wound, the closed estrangement, the place where 2 sides of the same water had learned to touch. Morvath, said the glass-eyed prophet in a voice the whole deep carried, old keeper, old surgeon, I refused you 10,000 years ago, and I have spent 300 years in the crack that refusal made, watching you grieve it into war. I was wrong. The water was wrong. And the healer who stands between us now has spent 2 books of her life, making us both answer for it. The glass eyes, burning with 2 directions light, turned from the corridor to the membrane, from the sorcerer to the surgeon. The door is open. It will not lock again. That is the healing's term, and it is not negotiable, and it was set by hands that are not mine and not yours. She turned fully to Lena, and for the first time in their acquaintance, the prophet between the worlds was not cryptic and was not gentle, and was not anything except a very old elf who had spent 3 centuries paying for someone else's mistake and her own. You asked at the pool, healer. You asked if the sentry at your father's door was mine. I told you no. I told you the truth, but not the whole truth. And you deserve the whole truth now, on the ground where it costs me. The glass eyes did not flinch. The glass eyes could not flinch. They looked in both directions at once and saw everything they contained. 10,000 years ago, when the Terima were still our keepers, mine, the waters, I sat on the council that refused their petition. I voted to refuse. I was the youngest, and I voted the way the elders voted, and I did not ask the question the healer would have asked. Why not? And 300 years later, my vote came home wearing a black cloak, and it cut a wound in the body of the water, and I have been standing in the wound ever since, because the wound was the only place left where I could see what my refusal had become. Her voice carried through the translucent pool, through the stone, through the deep. The prophet between the worlds is not a title, healer. It is a sentence. I stood in the crack because I made the crack, by voting no, when I should have voted why not. You asked the water why, in front of witnesses, and the water could not answer, because the water does not know why. I know why. We were afraid. Afraid that if the Terima kept their own dead, the keeping would fragment, every race its own water, every grief its own jar, and the deep would lose its wholeness. We chose unity over kindness, healer, and unity without kindness became a prison, and the prisoner burned the house down. And now? Lena asked, hands lifted, membrane held, the healing spreading below her like dawn across a sea. And now, a healer from a world with no keeping at all has taught us what we should have known from the beginning. Sarathiel's voice was the crack itself speaking, the space between the worlds finally having its say. That keeping is not owning, that the dead can be shared, that a mother who begs 1 hour with her kept child is owed the hour, and the keeping is not diminished by the giving. It is the same lesson your father taught you from the water's own mouth. Being kept is fine, and the kept are not in the dark, and the door need not be locked to be safe. She turned back to the corridor, to the ash-on-snow silence, to the oldest enemy of the age, standing behind a canyon king, with a dead spear in his hand, and 300 years of chosen grief on his shoulders. Come home, Morvath, or stay in the ash. But no, no, old keeper, that what you asked for, what your people bled for, what the whole world burned for, was always yours to have, and the only one who can refuse it now is you. Section 8. Morvath of the Terima stood in the last corridor of the southern deep, behind a canyon king's iron blade, with the rain of his own crystals falling red through the stone above him, and was silent for longer than any silence the age had produced. Lena watched him through the membrane, through the window that was no longer stone, through the clearing pool, through 500 steps of deep road, not with her eyes, which could not see that far, but with the grafts, 3 droplets of the deep's own tissue singing their kinsong through the healed water, and the healed water showing her what it saw. The grafts read Morvath the way the stethoscope read a chest, by vibration, by resonance, by the thing underneath the thing. What they read was not evil. That was the finding she would carry longest, longer than the war, longer than the wound, longer than the surgery. Underneath 300 years of chosen cruelty, underneath the ash and the crystals and the spear and the patient smile and the voice like snow taking its time to fall, underneath all of it, pressed flat by the weight of 3 centuries, the way a flower is pressed flat by the book that holds it, the grafts found grief. Old grief. The oldest grief in the world. The grief of a people who had loved the dead more carefully than anyone, and been told that loving was not enough reason to hold them. The finding did not excuse him. The finding did not make the crystals less stolen, the screams less real, the bridge less broken. But it made him, as Lena had told the war table in a lamplit cell a lifetime ago, comprehensible. And comprehensible, she had said, is how you beat something you can't kill. She had been wrong about that. Comprehensible was not how you beat it. Comprehensible was how you treated it. I hear you thinking, healer. The ash voice, from the corridor, carried through the healed water with terrible clarity. The borrowed shapes were gone. The crystal network was ash. The army above was dissolving in the red rain. And what stood behind Tareksai's blade was, for the first time in 300 years, only what it had always been. An elf, old beyond counting, black-cloaked, leaning on a dead spear, and tired. Tired the way Lena had been tired at 2:47 in the morning, one world and one lifetime ago, standing over a cold coffee in a humming corridor, keeping appointments because the alternative was asking herself why. I hear you diagnosing. It is deeply annoying, and I have not decided whether it is also the most honest thing that has ever been aimed at me. It's both, Lena said, through the water, through the stone. Most honest things are annoying. I learned that from my patients. Your father. The voice shifted, not softening, settling, the way a structure settles when it stops holding the thing it was built to hold. The water showed me, through the hook, in the hours before your scout ran my own house against me. It showed me a carpenter, rendered in light, holding your hand, squeezing 3 and then 1. And I confess to you, healer, I confess it here, in front of a king's blade and a prophet's glass eyes and a world's worth of drumming witnesses, that in 300 years of keeping the dead in crystals, I never once saw a keeping that content. My crystals held screams because screams were what I knew how to extract. The water held your father's laugh, and the laugh volunteered. Sareth, on the membrane, did not speak. The glass eyes burned with 2 directions worth of patience. You are offering me a door, Morvath said. An open keeping, shared, unhoarded, the thing my people asked for before we learned to take it by force. And the prophet tells me it was always mine to have, and the Canyon King tells me refusing it would make me the loneliest entry in a ledger that lasts. A pause, and something moved in the ash voice. Not warmth, not yet. Warmth would take longer than a corridor's length to cross 3 centuries of chosen cold, but something adjacent to warmth, something that knew warmth's address. And the healer tells me nothing at all, because the healer is letting me read my own chart, which is, I repeat, deeply annoying, and is also the only reason I am still standing here, instead of walking through this very determined king. The chart is yours, Morvath, Lena said. I don't read it for you. I don't make the decision for you. That's not what healers do, in my world or this one. I hold the door open. I tell you what's on both sides, and then I stand in the room while you decide, because nobody decides alone in my care. That's the standard. It doesn't change for sorcerers. The last red thread fell from the dead spear's tip and dissolved into the healed water at the membrane's edge, and the spear, which had held the brightest and cruelest light in all of Ilarion for 300 years, stood in Morvath's grip as what it had been before the light, a staff, a keeper's staff, the walking stick of the deep places, the tool of a people who had once tended the endings of every race with care. My people, Morvath said, the Tarima, the ones who crossed. 30 years of the crossing born, wearing borrowed shapes in your world and this one. When the crystals break, when the shapes dissolve, they do not die, healer. They unbecome. The kept script that held them together returns to the water, and what remains is, He stopped, and for the first time in the whole war, the ash voice broke, and what came through the break was the voice of a man who had sent his people through a wound for 30 years and knew exactly what the healing meant for every one of them. What remains, Sareth said gently from the membrane, is what was always underneath the script, an elf. Lost and frightened, and very far from anyone who remembers what they were before the cloak. The glass eyes turned to Lena. The healing does not end at the membrane healer. The crossing-born who survive the unbecoming will need a doctor, Lena finished. Yes, I know. I've been running that chart since the first crystal fell. She looked up through the clearing water at the silhouette of the oldest enemy of the age and said the thing that no war table would ever have authorized and no ledger would ever question. Morvath, your people are going to wake up on the surface of a world that spent 300 years calling them monsters. They're going to be disoriented, terrified, and alone. And the canyons, and the mountain, and the ice, all of them are going to have to decide very quickly whether to treat the unbecome as patients or as prisoners. She stood. The 3 grafts blazed at her body. The count rolled behind her like a river. I am deciding now, in front of every witness you asked for. The unbecome are patients, my patients, under my care, under my count, under the healer's law. And anyone on 2 worlds who has a problem with that can take it up with my schedule, which is, as you have observed, deeply annoying. Something happened to Morvath's face. It was not a smile. 3 centuries of chosen cold do not thaw in a corridor. But it was the geological event the canyons would have recognized very far upstream, and the ash voice, when it came, carried the weight of an age putting itself down. You are going to be an impossible doctor. I'm going to be your doctor, Lena said. That's the offer. Same standard, same chart. No crystals, no hooks, no architecture. Just the hands, and the count, and the door that stays open. Take it or leave it, Morvath. But take it or leave it now, because the membrane is healed, and the pool is clear, and I have a world to stitch up after you, and my shift started at 2:58 in the morning, and it has been the longest shift of my life. The dead spear, the keeper's staff, the 300-year-old walking stick of a people who had once loved the dead more carefully than anyone, lowered to the stone of the corridor. Slowly, the way a weapon is laid down when the hand holding it has forgotten, over 3 centuries, how laying down feels, and is having to relearn the whole gesture from the fingers up. Tareksai did not move his blade. He did not need to. The blade was a formality now, and both kings knew it, and the fortress of the canyon waited for the fortress of the ash to finish falling. Morvath of the Tarima set the dead staff on the stone. Then he unclasped the black cloak, the last garment of the last sorcerer of the last working of the oldest grief, and let it fall, and what stood in the corridor in the lamplight was tall and thin and very old, and had the high cheekbones and the pointed ears and the cut gemstone eyes of the people who had, 10,000 years ago, been the deep's own surgeons. I will need, said the elf, who had been the enemy of the age, in a voice from which the ash was falling like winter falling off a mountain, leaving something raw and strange and uncertain underneath. A very patient doctor. Noted, said Lena Marlowe. I have references.
She examined him, because the standard of care does not negotiate with history. Tareksai's wolves escorted the uncloaked sorcerer, the uncloaked elf, down through the deep roads to the membrane chamber, and Lena met her newest patient on the stone of the operating table where she had just healed a wound older than nations, and did what she did. She announced herself. Dr. Lena Marlowe, emergency medicine. I'm going to need to listen to your chest. The tall, thin elf who had been Morvath stood on the glowing membrane in the remains of his robes, looking at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time without a weapon in them, and the expression on the high-boned face was the expression Lena knew from every recovery ward of 2 worlds. The dazed vacancy of a person discovering, after a very long time spent being one thing, that they are allowed to consider being something else. Morvath is the name of the grief, he said quietly. It is not the name I was born with. The born name is... He stopped, searching. 3 centuries of architecture emptying out of the way. Oval. I think. Oval of the Deep Keepers. It has been a very long time since anyone used it, including me. Oval. She said it the way she said every patient's name on first meeting, plainly, without judgment, entering it into the record. I'm going to put the stethoscope on your chest, Avel. It's cold. Don't flinch. Everyone flinches. He flinched. 300 years of the age's most dangerous being, and he flinched at a cold disc on his sternum, and the sound that came out of him was so startled, so ordinary, that Phelan, standing guard at the chamber's edge, made the very small sound of a man who has just watched the monster under the bed turn out to be scared of the doctor and does not know what to do with the feeling. The reading was unlike any Lena had taken. 2 heartbeats, his own, elven slow, and beneath it the ghost of the keeping craft that had lived in him for 3 centuries, fading now but still present, the way a river's current is still present in a lake the river used to feed. No frost script. The script had gone home with the crystals. But scar tissue where the script had been. Deep, old, threaded through every system the way Rowan's hook had been threaded, except that this threading was self-inflicted. 300 years of a man carving the Deep's own alphabet into his own body because the Deep would not share it willingly. You were your own first crystal, Lena said, reading the scars. Weren't you? Before you ever cut the word out of anyone else, you cut it out of yourself. Someone had to prove it could be done. The voice that had been ash on snow was ash on nothing now, just a voice, old and wrecked and astonishingly ordinary, the voice of a craftsman describing a prototype. The first extraction was my own name. I wore it in a ring for 60 years before I understood what I had built. By then the grief had already... He stopped. You said chart. This is a very long chart, healer. I like long charts, Lena said. I'm a night shift doctor. We specialize in things that take until morning. Doromir found her afterward, on the membrane's edge, in the glow, and said nothing for a while, which was still the most fluent thing he did. And then, you just took the monster's pulse and told him not to flinch. I took my patient's pulse. The monster part was a symptom. 300 years of self-extracted grief. He was his own first victim, Doromir. That doesn't make the other victims less real. It makes the disease older than the damage. She leaned against his shoulder, 1 breath, 2, 3, and then 1. The war is over. The practice is just starting. When you said impossible, doctor, he was right about that at least. He was right about a lot of things, Lena said quietly. That's what made him dangerous. And that's what makes the chart worth reading. The pool cleared fully at noon. The whole column of water above the membrane went from the last pearl translucence to the Deep's own living glow, a pillar of light standing from the foundation of the world up through the healed quarantine floor, up through the canyon's deep roads, up through the shaft heads, and where it rose, the found dissolved. Not into darkness, into light. 900 years of the wrong keeping, met at last by the right one, releasing their rendered forms the way the colossus at the undervault had knelt, the way the wolves found had thinned in the crystal rain, gently, enormously, a whole age of the unstill going home to the shore where the kept are content. In the shaft heads of Karagvor, the wolves watched the black water in their tunnels go clear, watched the found standing at their salt lines thin to nothing, leaving behind only the warmth and the glow, and the faint sound of a river that was not a river, remembering itself from below the world. On the surface, the Ash Army's last cohort, the Crossing-born who had marched as an army of holes for 30 patient years, unraveled in the morning light as their crystal anchors rained their final red threads home. And what the canyon rim watchers saw as the shapes dissolved and the cloaks fell and the borrowed absences gave up their architecture was not a vanishing, it was an appearing. Hundreds of figures stumbling in the dust, blinking at a sun they had not properly seen in decades, some of them weeping, some of them simply standing, elves, all of them, as Sareth had said, lost and frightened, and very far from anyone who remembered what they were. Gazra's wolves reached them first. The first Fang's standing orders, transmitted by shaft drum from a king underground, were 4 words in the Canyon Doctrine's newest entry, Healer's Law. Count them in. The wolves of the eastern passes walked into the dissolving army of the oldest enemy of the age and began, lamp by lamp, hand by hand, name by name, to count. Lena came up out of the deep at dusk, carrying the cup of light, walking beside a canyon king who had held a corridor with a blade and a ledger, and an elf king who had held a graft over a wound with both hands for 6 hours, and a prophet who could finally step out of the crack she had spent 3 centuries standing in. And she came up into a canyon city that was learning, terrace by terrace, bell by bell, what a world looks like when the longest war in its history ends not with a victory, but with an intake. The unbecome filled the lower terraces, hundreds of them, former Crossing-born, former soldiers of the Ash, former instruments of the oldest grief, sitting in the canyon wind with blankets and water and the dazed expressions of patients waking from anesthesia that had lasted decades. The canyon healers worked among them, and the elf wardens worked among them, and Durm's dwarves worked among them, and over everything, steady, unbroken, the shaft drums kept the count. The healer's law, beating through a city that had been at war an hour ago and was now, by the fiat of one small human woman in a white coat, a recovery ward. Ithren found her at the war circle, where Lena had gone to sit down, and had instead stood for 10 minutes looking at the canyon sky, and the second surgeon put a cup of water in her hands, clean water, canyon water, the Deep's own circulation, and said, colleague to colleague, the unbecome are stabilizing. Most of them can speak. Several are asking for people who died before the cloaks were worn. Parents, children. They want to know if the kept can be visited now. A pause, and the past healer's weathered face held something that was not clinical at all. What do I tell them, healer? Tell them yes, Lena said, and her voice did the thing it did at the end of the longest shifts, the wobble she permitted, because the floor was honest. Tell them the door is open. Tell them to find running water, any running water, and ask. The keeping shares now. She drank the cup of canyon water, and the deep hummed through it, warm and vast and content, the way her father's voice had been content on a shore at the bottom of everything. That's the healing's term. That's the whole war, Ithreni, the keeping shares. And through the seed stone at her throat, warm, vast, carrying the voice of a blind old elf across half a world of healed water, came the Remembrancer's last relay of the war, and it was 6 words, and they were the 6 words the mountain of Canthalar would carve into the gate beside its river and its stars. The white flowers will not close again. But the war's end left 2 grafts in the world, and the healing's work unfinished. The tear, the cup, the fang, 3 of 5, blazing on the membrane's glowing stone, had done what 3 could do. Healed the quarantine, cleared the pool, opened the door, the keeping had locked for 10,000 years. But the deep's own voice, rising through the healed water with the contentment of a patient past the crisis but not yet discharged, said plainly what Lena already knew. 3 grafts reminded the wound. 5 grafts close it. The membrane heals, the pool clears, the door opens, but the wound itself, the tear in my body that Morvath cut 300 years ago, the portal that still hangs in the ash, that requires all 5 droplets, return to me at the Sareth, where the keeping surfaces into the world. 3 have come home. The olive and the crystal remain. The olive, the Tarian's golden fruit, wrapped in the bark of a sacred grove, held by giants who had not spoken aloud in 1,000 years and had deleted the word for enemy from their hands. The crystal, the 5th graft, Morvath's own, the red death crystal that had sat at his spear's tip for 3 centuries, now shattered, its stolen script returned, its physical form dissolved into a rain of threads. But a graft is not a crystal. A graft is a droplet of the deep, and the droplet, the water said, had not been in the crystal at all. It had been in the first extraction. The ring. Morvath's own name, cut from his own body 60 years before the First War, worn on his hand for 6 decades, and then, lost, said Avel, sitting on the membrane's edge in a borrowed canyon blanket, looking at the bare finger where a ring had been 3 centuries ago. Or hidden. Or kept. I cannot remember, healer. 300 years of architecture, and the foundations are... The foundations were the first thing I stopped looking at. The ring was the prototype. Everything after was built from it. If the 5th graft is still in the ring, then the ring is... The old elf searched the ruins of 3 centuries, and the searching was painful to watch, and Lena let him search without helping, because the chart was his, in the deep places, where we began, where the Keeper's temple stood, before the ash, under Ashvale. Under a fortress of fused obsidian, Doramir said, that no living army has ever entered. Under a fortress, Sarathiel corrected gently from the membrane, that is currently empty. Its master sits in a blanket in the canyons, and its army has become its patience, and its crystals are rain. The ash stands unguarded for the first time in 300 years. The glass eyes turned west, toward the far ovals, toward the country behind the world. But between the ash and the river stands the 4th graft. The Tarian's olive. The tall folk, the silent ones, who deleted the word for enemy 1,000 years ago, and who have not, I think, deleted the word for healer. A pause, and the prophet between the worlds, who could finally step out of the crack, smiled for the first time in Lena's knowing of her. I was born among the Tarian, healer. Before I was a prophet, before the council, before the vote, I walked their groves, I know the hand signs, and I owe you a road. Then we have 2 roads left, Lena said, and felt the whole remaining shape of the series resolve around her like a chart completing itself. West to the giants for the olive, east to the empty ash for the ring, and north to the Sareth, the river, the real river, the surface expression of the deep that was not a river, for the final healing. And for the first time since a woman grabbed my wrist at 2:58 in the morning, the wobble came, and she let it come, and the membrane's glow held her, and the canyon wind held her, and the count, beating through a healed world, held her. I know what I'm walking toward. So do we all, said the king of the Kant Peaks, with 2 burning lamps on his belt and the tear of the first tree blazing at his throat. And this time, healer, we walk it together. Section 9. The canyons gave them 3 days before the road, and Lena spent every hour of them building the thing the war's ending had made necessary, and no army in history had ever attempted. A field hospital for the unbecome. 319 former crossing-born had survived the dissolving on the canyon rim. 319 elves, stripped of the crystal script that had held them in borrowed shapes for years or decades, waking into bodies most of them barely recognized as their own. Muscle memory of limbs that no longer carried cloak weight, voices that had forgotten how to form words without the script's architecture, eyes that saw daylight as a kind of violence after so long in the engineered dark. Most of them could not say their own names. The script had overwritten everything personal. Aval's prototype had been designed, with a craftsman's terrible precision, to be comprehensive. What remained, after the script dissolved, was what the Deep's own keeping had protected underneath. The worth. The irreducible person, small and frightened, sheltering in the ruin of everything the grief had built on top of it. Lena built the ward the way she had built every ward of her career, by protocol, one patient at a time, adapting what worked and discarding what didn't. The count was the foundation. Every unbecome got a counter, a living person holding their hand and keeping the rhythm while the healer's team worked the recovery. Name finding first. Some remembered. Some had to be given temporary names. One elderly elf, surfacing through 60 years of script, said Sareth with such startled delight that the whole ward went quiet. Then orientation. Then the long, slow work of reteaching the body that it was safe to be singular. The canyon healers ran it. That was Lena's second great finding of the ward. The orcs, who had spent a week fighting the Found with the healer's law, turned out to be the finest recovery workers she had ever trained, because the recovery technique, hand, count, name, was identical to the combat technique, and the canyon's tunnel fighters could switch from war to care without changing their hands. Core's wolves, in particular, worked the ward with a fierce gentleness that rewrote Lena's clinical vocabulary. They held the unbecome the way they held salt lines, with total attention and zero pity, and the zero pity was the medicine, because the unbecome, like every patient Lena had ever treated, could smell condescension at 50 paces and closed like oysters around it. Aval worked the ward too. That had been the hardest fight of the 3 days. Harder than the membrane, harder than the corridor, because half the canyon wanted the former sorcerer in chains, and the other half wanted him in a shaft, and Lena's prescription. My patient, my ward, my call had required the full weight of 2 kings and a first fang to enforce. But Aval among the unbecome was the finding that justified the fight. He knew the script. He had written the script, and he could, with his ruined voice and his bare hands and the scars where 3 centuries of self-extraction had lived, do the thing no other healer could. He could read what the script had overwritten, the way a restorer reads the painting underneath a forgery, and help the buried person find their own name faster than any external technique. I built the cloaks, he said, on the second morning, kneeling beside a young elf woman whose script was taking longer than most to clear, his scarred fingers tracing the fading lines with the tenderness of a man dismantling his own worst work. I should know how to unbutton them. You're not unbuttoning, Lena said, working beside him, colleague to patient's architect, in the strangest clinical partnership of 2 worlds. You're translating. The script is your language, the Deep's language, forged into a tool, and she's trapped between the version of herself the tool made and the version the worth kept. You're the only person alive who speaks both. The old elf looked at her with eyes that had been ash on snow for 3 centuries and were now, slowly, becoming whatever they had been before. Something gray-green, exhausted, and learning to be uncertain. You are an impossible doctor, he said. I wish to state for the record that I am adjusting to this with dignity. Noted, said Lena, and handed him a cup of canyon water, and the Deep hummed through it, and neither of them flinched. They rode west from Karagvor on the 4th morning with a company that would have given the lore masters of any nation a cataloging crisis. The farewell at the war circle was conducted in the canyon way. Debts stated, ledgers balanced, no sentiment unanchored to a number. Tarek Sai's final entry was the longest the red ledger had received in a generation, and the king of the canyons read it aloud to the circle and the sky and the shaft drums rolling beneath. Let the ledger show. The fang of the first morning goes west with the healer's company, 3rd graft of the Deep, bitten down since the world was soft. It goes on the back of debts paid in full. 1 funeral stopped, 1 count taught, 1 nation's scouts carried home, 1 record corrected in crystal, 1 corridor held, 1 healer's law that taught the canyons the dark is not the enemy, the forgetting is the enemy, and the count is the cure. He paused, and the fortress settled, and the personal voice came through the formal like dawn through a canyon mouth. And let the ledger show 1 debt unpaid. The healer carries 3 grafts and owes the canyons a visit when the river is done. The hold has bored wolves and good soup, and the little one... The deep-set eyes, aimed at Lena with the full-banded warmth the canyon allowed itself in public, has earned both. Kor saw them off at the rim gate with Rook beside her, the boy upright and salt-crusted and carrying the deep mark scars like a campaign ribbon, and the wolves' farewell was the wolves' way, a salt pouch, pressed into the company's stores, with 100 portions packed by the Southern Patrol. For the tall folk, Kor said, and for the healer's new patient, if he behaves. A glance at Aval, at the column's edge, carrying the particular expression of a 300-year-old war criminal who has been placed on behavioral probation by a tunnel fighter captain. The canyons will be watching, Grey One. I am aware, said Aval, with a dignity that Lena suspected would become his primary survival mechanism for the foreseeable future. The healer has informed me that flinching is universal. I am taking it under advisement. The company that formed on the Western Road would have given the lore masters of any nation a cataloging crisis. The core held Lena and Doramir, Valus and Ithreni, Phelan and the 4 quiet wardens. Around them, Durm and 6 of his road patrol, the rest stayed to run the sluice works. Gazra and 12 wolves, the First Fang's personal escort, assigned by a king who could not come himself because a king's place in the canyon ledger was with his wounded. And at the column's edge, riding a borrowed canyon pony with the particular discomfort of a man who has not sat on anything alive in 3 centuries, Aval of the Deep Keepers, formerly Morvath of the Terima, wearing borrowed grey in place of the black and carrying, in a satchel at his side, the tools of his original craft, Keeper's instruments, bone and silver, recovered from the Ash Fortress's sealed vaults by a wolf squad Gazra had dispatched the morning after the surrender, because the First Fang, as she explained with her geological almost smile, collects debts the way the healer collects patience, before anyone can argue.
And walking at the head of the column, translucent in the morning light, visible only when the angle was right and the world was still, Sareth, the glass-eyed prophet, out of her crack at last, walking the surface of a world she had not properly touched in 300 years, her bare feet leaving no prints in the canyon dust, and her glass eyes burning with 2 directions worth of light that no longer needed to look both ways, because the wound between the worlds was healing, and the between was thinning, and the prophet between was, step by step, becoming simply a prophet of. It is strange, she said to Lena on the first evening, sitting at the fire's edge in the manner of someone relearning how to sit. For 300 years I stood in the crack and looked both ways. Now the crack is closing, slowly as healing does, and I am learning that both ways is not a direction, it is a punishment. One way is enough, healer. One way, with both eyes open, is more than enough. Welcome to the surface, Lena said. We have soup. The road west ran back up through the canyons, past the rimfall's broken shelf, and onto the frozen roads, the last crossing of the black glass, the white waste stretching north and west toward the far ovals and the country behind the world, where the Tarian kept their silence and their olive groves and their patient, enormous opinion of everyone else's volume. It was Sareth who navigated, and navigating, for her, was not a matter of maps. The road bonded them the way roads do, by friction, then by rhythm, then by the things that happen between. The friction was Aval. The company orbited him with the gravitational wariness of people who have been hunted by the sun and are now being asked to share a campfire with it. And Aval bore the orbiting with the rigid composure of a man who understands he is being allowed to live in increments. Violus watched him the way Violus watched everything, professionally, without warmth. And Gazra's wolves took rotating guard shifts at his tent with an attention to detail that was not discourtesy and was not trust and was very, very canyon. Phelan, improbably, was the first to crack the perimeter. On the 3rd night, he brought the former sorcerer a bowl of Ithreni's soup without being asked, sat down beside him without being invited, and said, in his new deep voice, the sentence that would in retrospect begin the strangest friendship of the war's aftermath. So, you're the one who did all that, and the healer told you not to flinch. What's it like, having a doctor scarier than you? Deeply inconvenient, said Aval, accepting the soup with fingers that had not held anything freely given in 3 centuries, and profoundly necessary. Your healer has a gift, boy soldier. She makes surrender feel like a promotion. That's not a gift, Phelan said. That's a count. 3 and then 1. You'll learn it. The friction eased by the 4th night. It would never become warmth. Some distances are climbed, not closed. But it became something Lena could chart. A working coexistence, built on shared road and shared soup and the slow accumulation of small witnessed moments. Aval heating water for the company's morning wash without being asked. Aval reading the fading script on Gazra's only remaining deep-marked wolf and finding the name underneath. Aval sitting alone at the fire's edge, staring at his bare ring finger for hours, the way a man stares at a scar that was once a door, and by the time the white waste opened west toward the far ovals, the company was not comfortable with the former enemy of the age, but it was functional with him, and functional, Lena had learned across 2 worlds of night shifts was where healing started. I was born in the ovals, Sareth said, as the company turned west off the black glass onto unmarked snow toward a country no road had ever crossed. Before the council, before the keeping, before the vote that broke everything, I was a girl in the tall grass, and the Tarian walked among us, and we among them, and we spoke in hands, because the hands were enough. They withdrew 1,000 years ago, not from anger, from conclusion. They concluded that the world's peoples had not yet learned what they needed to learn, and the Tarian decided to wait until the learning happened, and tend their groves, and say nothing, because the Tarian believe, the glass eyes glinted, that most of the world's trouble enters through the mouth. And what did they need to learn? What you have been teaching, healer. The prophet's voice was quiet, and for the first time, simply fond. That the count is older than the sword, that the wound is older than the war. That healing is not the opposite of damage. It is the remembering of what was there before the damage started. She looked west, across the white waste, toward the far grass. The Tarian have been waiting 1,000 years for someone to figure that out. I suspect, she said, with the first smile Lena had ever seen her wear twice. They are going to be delighted. They saw the first giant on the 9th day, and Lena understood immediately why the Tarian had deleted the word for enemy. When you are that size, you do not have enemies. You have weather. The ovals announced themselves before the giant did. The snow thinned over 2 days into brown grass, then green, then a green so deep and still it seemed painted. Vast meadowlands running to every horizon, windless, warm despite the season, as if the ground itself held a temperature the sky had no say in. The air changed. It thickened with growing, not humidity, vitality, a concentration of aliveness that made Lena's lungs feel underdressed. The trees began at the 2nd day, not forests, individuals, each one a landmark, massive silver-barked olives standing alone in the tall grass like elders at a council, their canopies wide enough to shelter a village, their roots visible at the surface in knotted silver rivers that ran from trunk to trunk through the meadow. And along the roots, faintly, unmistakably, the golden glow, the deep's own light, surfacing through the wood, running the root network like the undervault's coal glass, ran the ember way. The whole country was irrigated from below, and the irrigation was not water, it was keeping. The deep, here, was not under the world. It was in the garden. The cup answered it. A warmth at Lena's back that had been humming all day crescendoed into a pulse so strong she gasped, and Doromir's tear blazed, and the fang at her belt vibrated with a frequency that made the grass lie down in a circle around the company, and every olive tree within sight turned its silver leaves, all at once, toward her, the way flowers turn to sun. We are being announced, Sareth said calmly. The grove knows the grafts. It has been singing about them since the crystals broke. I told you, the olives started singing. They are the Tarian's library, healer. Everything the roots carry, the trees remember, and the trees are very, very old. Then the giant stood up from behind a ridge that turned out to be a grove's root ridge, and the company discovered what the trees had been singing about. He stood on the horizon like a feature of the landscape, and then the landscape moved, and what Lena had taken for a snow-dusted rise resolved into shoulders, and the shoulders were attached to a torso that went up and up and up into the pale sky, until the head, small with distance, turned toward the approaching column with the slow courtesy of a mountain noticing a bird. The Tarian was perhaps 6 meters tall, wrapped in woven linen the color of winter grass, and the vast face, visible now as the company approached, necks craning, the wolves' hands on weapons they already knew were ornamental, held an expression Lena recognized from across every divide she had ever crossed. A gardener interrupted, patient, unhurried, mildly curious about the very small things that had walked into the grove. The giant was carrying a watering vessel the size of a canal boat, tending a grove of silver-barked olive trees that stood in the meadow like a congregation of patient monks, each one 3 times the height of the trees in Lena's world, and bearing, among their silver leaves, the faint golden glow of fruit that was not entirely fruit. The giant saw the column. The giant saw Sareth, and the giant set down the watering vessel, slowly, enormously, the way a planet sets, and made one sign with one enormous hand. You came back. Sareth answered with both of hers, small and translucent in the snow. I brought someone. The giant looked down, a long way down, at the small human woman with the stethoscope and the beads and the cup of light warm at her back, and made one more sign, and Sareth translated it with tears running down her translucent face and her glass eyes blazing in two directions worth of something that was not prophecy and not penance and was, at last, simply joy. The Tarian says, we heard the count. Through the roots, through the water, through the deep beneath the groves. The whole world has been drumming for a season, and the olives started singing last week, and we have been waiting. We have been waiting a very long time, for the one who taught the world to keep time. The giant knelt. 6 meters of silent, patient, enormous being, kneeling in the tall grass beside a grove of singing olives, bringing the vast face down to Lena's level. And the eyes, at this distance, were kind and deep, and the color of everything growing, and they held no fear of anything at all. The kneeling alone took 10 seconds, and in those 10 seconds, the company lived through the most disorienting adjustment of the whole war, gentleness at scale. The ground shook, not violently, rhythmically, like a heartbeat transmitted through earth, and the olive's silver leaves caught the shudder and turned it to music, and the roots beneath the grass pulsed gold, and the cup and the tear and the fang answered the pulse with their own 3-part song, and for one held breath the whole oval hummed, grove and grafts and giant and the deep beneath all of it, with the frequency of things that belonged to each other and knew it. The face, at Lena's level now, was weathered the way continents are weathered, gently, over epochs. The expression was not awe and was not reverence and was, Lena realized, the expression she had been searching for in every culture she had crossed and had never quite found until now, recognition without agenda. The giant looked at her the way the water had looked at her on the shore, as something it had been expecting, with no plans for what to do about it except be present. Other giants were arriving. She could feel them through the ground before she saw them. Footfalls like distant drums, the grass parting in long, slow lines across the oval, and they came to the grove 1 by 1, and 2 by 2, and in slow groups of 5 and 10, and every one of them knelt, and the meadow filled with kneeling mountains, and the company of 2 worlds stood at the center of a circle of the largest people in the history of either, and every enormous face wore the same expression, and every enormous hand was open, and the grove sang, and the roots ran gold, and nobody said a single word, because the Tarian had concluded 1,000 years ago that the important things came in through channels the mouth had no authority over. The sign the giant made next needed no translation. Lena had seen it in 100 recovery wards, from 100 patients waking. An open hand, extended, palm up, show me. And Lena Marlowe, standing in the tall grass of the country behind the world, with 3 grafts singing at her body, and 2 burning lamps on her king's belt, and a whole world's drumming in her blood, reached up and put her small human hand on the vast open palm, and the olive groves singing crested like a wave, and the deep's golden light rose through every root and every branch and every silver leaf at once, and somewhere in the canopy above them, hidden for 10,000 years in the bark of the oldest tree, wrapped in silver wood like a letter in an envelope, the golden olive began to glow. If you have ever been expected, truly expected, across a distance measured not in miles but in patience, then you know what the healer felt in that vast, gentle palm, the end of being a stranger and the beginning of being the reason the wait was worth it. Section 10. The Tarian gave the olive the way the Tarian did everything, in silence, with both hands, and with a patience that made 10,000 years feel like a reasonable amount of time to have waited. The grove elder, the giant who had knelt first, who Sareth's signs named as Olen, keeper of the central groves, one of the oldest living beings on the surface of the world, climbed the great silver tree at the meadow's heart with a slowness that was not age but ceremony. Every handhold chosen, every branch acknowledged, the way a surgeon acknowledges the body before the first cut. The other Tarian watched from their kneeling circle, 60 of them now, the whole population of the central ovals gathered in the singing grass, and not one sound rose from the assembly except the olive's own music. A deep, woody, harmonic hum that Lena felt in her molars and her grafts and the bones of her feet, the grove itself keeping the count in a key that predated drums. The golden olive sat in the crook of the oldest branch, wrapped in silver bark the way a letter is wrapped in an envelope, and when Olen's vast hands closed around it, gently, enormously, the way planets close around orbits. The hum of the grove crested, and every tree in the oval turned its silver leaves toward the center, and the root network beneath the grass blazed gold from horizon to horizon, the whole country lit from below like the undervault's ceiling, and Lena understood, watching from the base of the tree with her neck at its limit, that the grove was not giving up a treasure. It was delivering a letter it had been holding for 10,000 years. Olen descended with the olive cupped in both hands, a fruit the size of a human head, gold as the cup, warm as the fang, pulsing with the deep's own light, and knelt again, and held it out to the small human woman at the tree's root, and the sign the giant made with the giving was the sign Sarathiel translated through silent tears. This was planted the morning the deep gave us our drop. 10,000 years the tree has held it, and in 10,000 years we have never once asked what it was for, because the Tarian do not ask what gifts are for. Gifts are for giving. Take it, counter. The tree says, "It is time." Lena received the fourth graft of the deep into her hands, and the four sang together, tear, cup, fang, olive, and the singing was a chord that used her body as its instrument. 4 droplets of the foundation of 2 worlds, reunited across 10 millennia of separation. And the sound they made was not triumph and was not completion. It was almost 4 notes of a chord that needed 5. The missing note ached like a phantom limb. Avel felt it too. He had been standing at the grove's edge throughout the giving, kept at distance by Gazra's wolves, by protocol, by his own rigid understanding that the former architect of the age's worst grief did not belong at the center of its oldest gentleness. And Lena saw him flinch when the 4-note chord struck. Not the stethoscope flinch, a deeper one, the flinch of a man hearing his own absence in a harmony he had once been part of. She went to him, because that was the standard of care, and because no patient of hers stood at the edge of anything alone. "The ring," she said. "Avel, the 4 are singing, and the 5th is missing, and you can feel where it is. I can see it in your face. The prototype, your own name, cut out of yourself 60 years before the First War. Where did you leave it?" The old elf looked at his bare ring finger, and the look was the look from the campfire, the staring at a scar that was once a door. And when he spoke, the voice was not ash, and was not snow, and was not anything except a very old craftsman, remembering. "The Keeper's Temple, under what is now Ashvale, under the fortress I built on top of it, because building on top of things was all I knew how to do with grief." The grey-green eyes came up, and they were wet, and the wetness was as startling on that high-boned face as the flinch had been on the stethoscope. "I sealed it in the temple's deepest vault the day I left the keeping. I told myself it was stored. It was not stored, healer. It was buried. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole disease, and I have spent 3 centuries not knowing which side of it I was on." "Stored is for later," Lena said. "Buried is for never." "Which one did you mean, Avel?" 300 years ago, in that vault." "Which one?" The silence lasted a long time, and the grove held it without comment, because the Tarian understood silences the way surgeons understood wounds, as necessary openings. "Later," said Avel of the Deep Keepers, and the word came out of him like the first breath of a patient surfacing from the longest anesthetic in history. "I meant later. I meant I would come back for it when the water opened its door, and the water never opened its door, and later became never, and never became war." He looked at his hands, the scarred, bare, unbearably ordinary hands of an elf who had once been the Deep's own surgeon, and said the sentence that would drive the 4th book. "The ring is under the ash. The 5th graft of the Deep, healer, my own name, the prototype of everything I built and everything I broke, is waiting in a vault beneath a fortress I cannot enter alone, because the fortress knows my voice, and the fortress was built to obey it, and if I walk those halls again without your doctor," Lena finished. "Yes, I know. You're on my chart, Avel. We go together." "Healer." Doromir's voice, from the circle, carrying the weight of a king who has been doing map work while the medicine works. "Ashvale is east, the Sareth is north, and between us and both of them lies the whole width of Alarion. Through country the war has unmade, the found dissolving, the unbecome waking, the crystal rain still falling in the deep places. The road is not one road, it is 2, and at the end of the second, 5 grafts must stand together at the river where the keeping surfaces into the world." He came to her, and the tear blazed, and Bram's and Otter's lamps still burned at his belt, still burning, through a war, through a surgery, through the whole country of the dark. I have been mapping it all morning with Rowans. He stopped, and the pause held 30 years and one shore. With the intelligence Rowan left us. The Sareth runs through the northern foothills of the Kant Peaks, 3 days' ride from Kantalar. If we ride north from the ovals, we reach the mountain by the season's turn. And from the mountain, provisioned, reinforced, with the remembrancer and the lawmasters and the whole strength of the 9 houses, we ride east to Ashvale for the ring, and north to the river for the healing. He laid it out like a gift, which it was, a way home, through the war's wreckage, with the war's purpose intact. 4 grafts to the mountain, Lena said, and the route assembled in her mind the way a surgical plan assembles, not by hope, but by anatomy. The ring from Ashvale, 5 grafts to the Sareth, and when the 5 stand at the river, the wound closes, Sareth said, from the grove's shimmering heart, translucent and real and present for the first time in 300 years. Not closes, heals. The portal in the ash was cut into the deep's body, a wound in water. 5 grafts, returned, at the place where the keeping surfaces, the deep receives its own tissue, and the wound, healer, the wound does what every wound does when the body's own material comes home. It granulates, Lena whispered. New tissue, not scar, growth. The portal doesn't seal, it becomes what it should have been from the beginning, Sareth finished. Not a wall between 2 worlds, a membrane, like the one you healed under the canyons, a living surface, permeable, through which the keeping flows in both directions. The dead visited, the living remembered. 2 shores, 1 deep, and a door, healer, that opens from both sides, because a door that opens from both sides is the only kind that was ever worth building. The grove sang. 4 grafts pulsed, and Lena Marlowe, holding the 4th piece of the oldest puzzle in the world, looked around the singing oval at the company she had gathered. Elf and dwarf and orc and human and giant and prophet and the former enemy of the age, every one of them changed by the road and the count and the terrible, relentless, beautiful insistence of being shown, and said the thing that would carry them north. Then let's go home, all of us, to the mountain first, because there's a city of 10,000 that's been drumming for us since the day I left, and a blind old woman who's been holding the whole war's memory alone, and a boy with a drum bead who I owe a very long story. She touched the beads at her throat, the drum, the salt, the ember, and now, handed to her by a giant's palm, a tiny seed of olive gold that Olen had pressed into her hand at the giving's end without ceremony or explanation, the Tarian's way, a gift for giving. And there's a woman in another world who's been making Sunday phone calls into a silence I helped build, and a fence that isn't finished, and a message I'm carrying from the foundation of 2 worlds that I've owed her for 11 years. Her voice did the wobble, and the wobble was the truest note in the chord. It's time to go home, both of them. The company answered, not with a vote, and not with a cheer, and not with any instrument the protocol of any single nation would have recognized. Violis spoke first, because Valis always spoke first when the speaking was load-bearing. I swore an oath in a forest that I would put an arrow through the chosen of Sareth. I have watched you for a war instead, healer. Where you walk, my bow rides. That is the oath's replacement, and it outranks the original, and I am not taking questions. Gazra, behind him, showed her tusks. The canyons sent 12 wolves. The canyons will bring 12 wolves home, after the river. The First Fang's schedule is not negotiable, and the First Fang's schedule currently says Ashvale, Sareth, Soup, Durm, square as his own anvil. The ice folk go where the lamps go. The lamps go north. File it in the ledger. The Deep King will want receipts. Ithreni, practical as a splint. I did not cross 2 nations and 1 underworld to miss the final surgery. Countrywoman to the end, healer. My satchel is packed. Phelan, voice cracked and luminous. I found the count by accident on a barricade. I am not letting it out of my sight until it reaches a river, and the river does what rivers do, and somebody writes it all down properly. I volunteer for the writing. Nobody at home will believe a word, and I intend to make them believe everyone. And Aval, at the edge, where the edge was his country now, and might be for a long time, said nothing for a while, and the nothing was heavier than everyone else's words combined. And when he finally spoke, it was in the voice that had been Morvath's and was now becoming, syllable by uncertain syllable, someone else's. I built the wound. I should be present when it heals. That is not redemption. The healer has been very clear that redemption is not a clinical term, and that my chart is long, and that the chart does not lie. But attendance is a clinical term, and attending the healing of the thing I broke is... The grey-green eyes found Lena's, and the uncertainty in them was the most human thing he had ever shown. It is later, healer. The later I meant. 60 years late, and 300 years of wrong between then and now, but later. I would like to attend. Noted, Lena said. Patient is cleared for travel. Bring the soup. The Tarian's farewell was conducted in the way the Tarian conducted all things, without a single word. Olen and the kneeling circle rose, slowly, enormously, the meadow shaking with the geometry of 60 giants standing, and the grove elder made one final sign, which Sareth translated with the smile she was learning to wear more than once. The trees will sing you north, through the roots, through the deep, through every olive and every river between here and your mountain. You will not walk unheard. Counter. The Tarian have waited 1,000 years. We can wait a little longer for the river. And then, because the Tarian had deleted the word for enemy, but had never once deleted the word for gift, Olen knelt one final time, and with fingers vast enough to cup a house, did the smallest and most precise thing Lena had ever seen at any scale, threaded a single silver olive leaf, luminous, veined with gold, no bigger than a bookmark, onto the cord at her throat, between the ember bead and the salt, and withdrew. 5 tokens now: the drum of Canthalar, the salt of the undervault, the ember of the emberway, the olive seed of the deep, and the silver leaf of the Tarian, threaded by a giant's fingertip with a precision that proved, once and for all, that gentleness is not the opposite of strength, it is the proof of it. They rode north from the ovals under a sky that had never looked quite like this before, because it hadn't been. The wound between the worlds was healing, and the healing changed the light. The 2 moons still hung at dusk, silver and rose gold, but between them, faint as a breath on glass, a third light had appeared, a shimmer, a transparency, as if the sky itself had developed a window, and through the window, at certain angles in certain light, the company could see, impossibly, dizzyingly, like looking through deep water, the ghost of another sky, stars that were not Ilarian stars, a blue that was not this world's blue, a suggestion, a promise, a membrane forming where a wound had been. She's right, Phelan said, looking up at the shimmer on the second night, his voice wrecked and wondering. It's not going to be a wall, it's going to be a window. He turned to Lena, and the boy soldier who had found the count by accident and carried it through a war looked at the healer who had taught 2 worlds to keep time and asked the question the shimmer was asking, the question the whole remaining series would answer. Can you see your world from here? Not yet, Lena said, and looked north, toward the mountain, toward the river, toward the fence that wasn't finished, and the shift that had started at 2:58, and the 9 minutes her father had been saving for 11 years. But I'm getting closer. Doromir rode beside her in the shimmer light, and the quiet between them had become, over the course of a war, its own country, mapped and settled, with its own customs and its own gravity, comfortable the way only a silence between 2 people who have stood over the same wounds can be comfortable. The membrane, he said, on the 3rd night, watching the shimmer where 2 skies were learning to see each other. You said it will be permeable, a door that opens from both sides. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the ghost of her world through the thinning between, and the question he was building was the question they had been building since a clearing in Silvarin. When the 5 grafts stand at the Sareth, and the wound becomes a window, the window opens, Lena, to your world, to the clock that's been ticking, to a Tuesday. She had known this was coming. She had charted it, filed it, and refused to read the file, because some charts require the patient to be ready, and she had not been ready until a giant's open palm and a company of every nation swearing the same road had made her ready. I know, she said, and you could go home. I could go home. The words sat in the shimmer light, real as the 2 moons, real as the ghost of a blue that was not this sky's blue. The clock reads 3:49, or whatever it reads now, and somewhere on the other side of that shimmer, a hospital is filing missing person reports, and a mother is not sleeping, and the fence, the wobble, the honest one. The fence is not finished, Doromir. No, said the king of the Kant Peaks, it is not. He reached across the space between their saddles and took her hand, and the tear pulsed its slow 10,000-year count against his throat, and Bram's and Otter's lamps burned steady in the dark between 2 worlds. So we finished the river first, and then we finish the fence, and if the window opens from both sides, healer. The dawn on a mountain smile, the one that had changed everything in a clearing that felt like another life. Then I intend to learn what a Tuesday is, personally. You'll hate Tuesdays, Lena said, holding his hand, holding the count, holding the whole weight of 2 worlds in the grip of a woman who had learned, across a war and a surgery and a shore, that holding was not the same as carrying. Holding was lighter, holding was shared. Everyone hates Tuesdays. Then I will hate them with you, said Doromir, and that will be enough. If you have ever ridden toward a home you left behind, carrying more of yourself than you brought, if you have ever looked up at a sky and seen, through it, the ghost of a window that is not yet open but is no longer a wall, then you know what the company felt, riding north through the shimmer with 4 grafts singing and 1 more waiting in the ash and a river waiting beyond it, not the end of the journey, the beginning of the arrival, and in the world she was arriving toward. In a city that did not believe in elves, in a hospital that smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, the clock above the nurse's station of St. Aldrich's, which had held its breath at 2:59 for 1 impossible month and then ticked to 3 o'clock on a night of ash and stars, continued, with gathering speed, to move. 3:47, 3:48, 3:49. The night administrator, who had been filling incident reports since the vanishing and who would never, in a long career, file a satisfactory one, looked up from her desk at the soft sound of the emergency bay doors opening, the automatic doors, the ones that needed a gurney's weight to trigger, and saw no one. No gurney, no patient, just the doors, cycling open and closed, as if something were standing on the threshold, deciding. In the corridor beyond the bay, a mop bucket that had been stationary for hours tipped, gently, without being touched, and a thin stream of water ran across the linoleum, against the slope, toward the emergency doors, and pooled at the threshold where the puddle had been. The duty nurse, rounding the corner, watched the water run uphill, and stopped, and held very still, and did the thing that night shift workers learn to do when the building does something the building should not do. She checked the clock, noted the time, and kept walking, because the shift was not over, and the shift was the only real thing, and whatever the water was doing, it would still be doing it at handover. And on the threshold's floor, in the fluorescent light, visible for 1 frame of the security footage before the doors closed for the last time, the puddle, small, clear, warm to the touch, the responding nurse would note when she knelt in it 10 seconds later, warm and faintly glowing, and she would leave this out of her own report because some things do not survive paperwork. It smelled of olives. The deep was learning the doors.